Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, tucked between two towering oaks that blocked most of the sunlight. It was old, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, but Evelyn had always loved it. It had belonged to her grandmother, and after her passing, Evelyn moved in, hoping for a fresh start. The backyard was small and unremarkable, except for a patch of dirt that never seemed to catch the sun. No matter the time of day, shadows pooled there, deep and unmoving. The rest of the yard flourished in the warm light, but that one spot remained barren. Evelyn had always been drawn to it. One evening, she stood at the edge of the shadowed patch, holding a packet of seeds she had found in the attic. The paper was old and crinkled, the ink faded. The only thing she could make out was a single word scrawled across the front: grow. She knelt down, pressing her fingers into the cool, dark soil. One by one, she buried the seeds, covering them gently before patting the earth down. The moment she finished, a cold wind rippled through the yard. The trees rustled, whispering like unseen voices. Evelyn shivered and stepped back. The next morning, something had changed. The barren patch was no longer empty. Small, dark sprouts had pushed up through the soil, their leaves curling toward the shadows as though reaching for something unseen. Evelyn frowned. She had expected it to take days, maybe weeks, for anything to grow. But overnight, that wasn't possible. She knelt down, brushing her fingers over the tiny leaves. They felt strange, softer than they should be, almost like skin. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. As she lay in bed, she swore she heard something else beneath it, a faint rustling, like voices drifting through the air. By morning, the plants had grown taller. Their leaves had darkened to an unnatural shade of green, nearly black. The stems twisted as if writhing in unseen hands. Evelyn hesitated before stepping closer. As she reached out, a whisper brushed against her ear. "Evelyn." Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the yard was empty. The trees swayed in the breeze, casting long shadows across the ground. "You buried us." The whisper came again, curling around her like smoke. Her heart pounded. She stepped back, staring at the plants. Had they spoken? She swallowed hard, shaking her head. No, that wasn't possible. She was tired. She hadn't been sleeping well. That was all. But as she turned to leave, the plants shifted. The leaves quivered, and in the silence, she heard something new. A faint, wet sound, like something breathing beneath the soil. Evelyn didn't return to the garden for the rest of the day. She tried to keep herself busy, cleaning the house, unpacking old boxes, anything to distract herself. But no matter what she did, her mind kept drifting back to the plants. By nightfall, the whispers had returned. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the wind carried faint voices through the open window. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the covers tighter around her. "Evelyn." Her breath hitched. "Come back to us." She sat up sharply, heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty, but the voice had been so close, as though someone had been leaning over her bed, whispering directly into her ear. She hesitated before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Slowly, she crept to the window and peered outside. The garden was different. The plants had grown taller, their dark leaves unfurling in strange, twisting shapes. They no longer resembled anything natural. Evelyn's stomach churned. She closed the window, locked it, and climbed back into bed, forcing herself to ignore the way the whispers seemed to grow louder. The next morning, she woke to a knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it. Mrs. Calloway, her elderly neighbor, stood on the porch, her sharp eyes scanning Evelyn's face. Mrs. Calloway said, "You look tired, dear." Evelyn forced a smile. Rough night. Mrs. Calloway frowned. I don't mean to pry, but I heard voices last night. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Mrs. Calloway continued, lowering her voice. They were coming from your backyard. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She forced a laugh. Probably just the wind. Mrs. Calloway didn't look convinced. She shifted, glancing past Evelyn toward the yard. That patch of soil. I've never seen anything grow there before. Evelyn stiffened. I planted something a few days ago. Mrs. Calloway's expression darkened. She lowered her voice further. My mother used to say that soil was cursed, that nothing should ever be buried there. Evelyn swallowed. Why? Mrs. Calloway hesitated. People used to go missing in this neighborhood. Years ago, always at night. Some swore they heard voices calling them from the shadows. Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine. Mrs. Calloway studied her face. If I were you, dear, I'd dig them up. Evelyn forced another smile, nodding politely. I'll think about it. Mrs. Calloway sighed, stepping back. Be careful. Evelyn shut the door, locking it behind her. Her hands trembled. Outside, the wind rustled through the garden. The whispering had started again, and this time it was calling her name. I'll continue with the next section in the following response. You said, continue with the next part of the story. ChatGPT said. Evelyn stood frozen in her hallway, her breath shallow. The whispers from the garden pressed against the walls of the house, seeping through the cracks like an unwelcome presence. She clenched her fists. This was ridiculous. It was just plants, just wind, just her tired mind playing tricks on her. She took a deep breath and marched to the back door. The garden was waiting. The plants had grown even more overnight. Their dark leaves shimmered in the dim morning light, curling around each other like grasping fingers. The stems had thickened, twisting unnaturally, pulsing as if something was moving inside them. A cold weight settled in her stomach. She grabbed the gardening shears from the porch. Evelyn muttered, "Enough of this." She stepped onto the dirt, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. The air smelled strange, earthy, but also sharp, metallic. She knelt beside the largest plant and reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the stem, a voice rasped from the leaves. "You buried us, Evelyn." She yanked her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. The leaves trembled. "You buried us." Evelyn's heart pounded. She gripped the shears tighter and snapped the blades around the nearest stem. The plant let out a sound. Not the crisp snap of a cut stem. Not the rustling of leaves. A scream. High-pitched and wet, like something alive being torn apart. Evelyn stumbled back, dropping the shears. The plant shuddered violently, black sap bubbling from the wound, staining the soil beneath it. Her stomach twisted. She turned and ran back inside, slamming the door shut. Her hands shook as she locked it. The whispers did not stop. If anything, they grew louder. "Evelyn." She pressed her hands to her ears. "You can't cut us away." The walls groaned around her. The house felt smaller, darker. She ran to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. She whispered to herself, "This isn't real." The pipes creaked. A slow, rhythmic sound, like something breathing beneath the floor. Evelyn gripped the counter. Then the whisper came again, curling against her skin like cold fingers. "Go check the attic." Her breath hitched. She had not been to the attic since moving in. She didn't want to go now. But something deep inside her, something she could not explain, was pulling her toward it. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she climbed the stairs. At the end of the hallway, the attic door loomed. The whispering grew louder. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. She turned it. The door creaked open. Darkness yawned before her, and in the silence something moved. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold of the attic. The darkness inside felt thick, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something rotten. She swallowed hard. A faint shuffling noise came from the far end of the attic. She whispered, just the house settling. But she didn't believe it. She stepped inside. The wooden floor groaned beneath her weight. Dust swirled in the faint light filtering through the slatted vents. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting unnaturally. She took another step. The whispering grew louder. "You buried us, Evelyn." Her breath caught. Something glinted in the far corner of the attic. A box. Small. Wooden. Covered in thick dust. She hesitated, but the pull inside her was too strong to resist. She knelt and brushed the dust away. The box was old, the wood warped with age, the metal latch rusted but not locked. She pried it open. Inside was a bundle of yellowed fabric, tied together with brittle twine. Her fingers trembled as she untied the knot and pulled the fabric apart. Bones. Small. Fragile. A child's bones. Evelyn recoiled, a choked gasp escaping her throat. The bundle fell from her hands, scattering across the wooden floor. The whispering surged around her, swirling like a storm. "You buried us." Memories flooded her mind. She was a child standing in the backyard, her hands covered in dirt. A woman's voice, sharp, urgent. "Hurry, Evelyn. No one can know." Underscore. Her mother. Evelyn clutched her head. No, that wasn't possible. She had no memory of this. And yet, she did. A little boy. Barefoot, laughing, running through the yard. He had tripped. Fallen. Hit his head on the edge of a stone. Her mother had screamed. Had grabbed her wrist. Had made her dig. "We have to hide it, Evelyn. We have to hide him." Underscore. Evelyn's chest heaved. She had buried him. And now he was growing. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over the scattered bones. The whispers were deafening now, filling every inch of the attic. "You can't run from us." She turned and fled, slamming the attic door behind her. Her pulse thundered as she bolted down the stairs. Outside, the garden was alive. The plants had grown taller, thicker, their dark leaves reaching toward the windows. Their roots pulsed beneath the soil like veins. The whispering no longer came from the wind. It came from them. From him. "You buried me, Evelyn." A sharp knock at the front door made her jump. She whirled around, heart hammering. Mrs. Calloway. Evelyn's hands shook as she opened the door. The old woman's eyes were dark, unreadable. She studied Evelyn carefully. Mrs. Calloway said, "I heard screaming." Evelyn's throat was dry. I found something. In the attic." Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. She said, "You remember now, don't you?" Evelyn's blood ran cold. Mrs. Calloway knew. She had always known. And outside, the garden whispered hungrily, waiting. Evelyn stepped back from the door, her stomach twisting. She whispered, "You knew?" Mrs. Calloway didn't blink. She shifted slightly, her frail hands gripping the porch railing. She said, "We all knew." Evelyn's mouth went dry. She glanced over the old woman's shoulder at the rest of the neighborhood. The houses stood silent, the windows dark, yet somehow she could feel them watching. Mrs. Calloway took a slow step forward. She said, "We let your mother stay because she took care of it. We let you stay because we thought it was over." Evelyn's breath hitched. She whispered, "It's not over." The wind shifted. The garden rustled behind her, the whispering growing thick, impatient. The plants curled against the windows, their shadows stretching into the house. Mrs. Calloway exhaled, her shoulders sagging. She said, "You never should have planted anything." Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine. She whispered, "What do I do?" Mrs. Calloway's gaze was heavy, her expression unreadable. She said, "You know." Evelyn swallowed hard. She stepped away from the door and turned toward the garden. The air felt denser now, thick with something she couldn't name. She walked to the edge of the garden, her fingers trembling at her sides. The plants swayed, their stems arching toward her, eager, expectant. "Evelyn." Her name curled through the air like breath on the back of her neck. She knelt. The soil was damp, unnaturally cold. She pressed her hands into the dirt. The whispering stopped. Silence stretched over the yard. Then, the ground shifted. The earth pulsed beneath her fingers, parting like soft flesh. Something pushed upward, small, bone-white. A hand. Evelyn choked on a scream as tiny fingers curled against the air, gripping at nothing. The arm that followed was thin, wrapped in roots that pulsed like veins. The boy was waking up. Evelyn stumbled back. Mrs. Calloway stood at the porch, her face unreadable. Evelyn gasped, "Help me." Mrs. Calloway didn't move. She said, "You have to finish it." The arm twitched. The soil swelled. A shape began to rise, small and twisted, its form writhing beneath the roots. Evelyn's vision swam. The memories crashed into her like waves, drowning her. Her mother's hands, rough and desperate, forcing hers to dig. The boy's lifeless face, slack, dirt smudged across his cheek. The garden growing in that same spot, thriving in the shadows. The whispers had never stopped. She had just learned to ignore them. Until now, a voice, thin and rasping, drifted up from the shifting soil. "You left me here." Evelyn clutched her head. She whispered, "I didn't mean to." The boy's fingers dug into the dirt. "You buried me." A sob wrenched from her throat. Mrs. Calloway said, "You know what you have to do, Evelyn." The wind howled through the garden, bending the stalks, rattling the leaves. The plants shuddered, eager, waiting. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps. She knew. She had always known. Her hands curled into fists. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Then she reached for the garden shears. The whispering surged, and the soil split open beneath her feet. Evelyn barely had time to react before the ground collapsed beneath her. Cold, damp earth swallowed her knees as she fell forward, her hands sinking into the pulsing roots. The garden trembled, shivering in anticipation. The boy's hand stretched higher, breaking through the last layer of dirt, reaching for her. "You left me here." His voice was inside her head now, curling around her thoughts like ivy. Evelyn's breath hitched as her fingers found the garden shears. Cold metal. Solid. Real. Mrs. Calloway's voice was distant. "You must finish it." Evelyn shook her head. She whispered, "I don't know how." The wind howled through the yard. The plants swayed violently, their shadows twisting like grasping fingers. The whispers rose, filling the night, overlapping, chanting. "Bury it. Cut it. Feed it." Evelyn's stomach twisted. The garden wanted something. The house, the neighborhood. They had all survived because her mother had known what to do. Because her mother had made the right choice. But what had that choice been? The boy's face was emerging now, dirt crumbling from his fragile features. Hollow eyes, lips dry and cracked, skin stretched too thin over bone. His mouth opened, black soil spilled from between his teeth. "You should have saved me." Evelyn choked back a sob. Her hands shook as she lifted the garden shears. She whispered, "I didn't know." The roots twisted around the boy's throat, pulling him upright. He was still half buried, trapped in the tangled vines, but he was waking up. The garden was waking up. Mrs. Calloway whispered, "You must feed it." Evelyn turned sharply. She gasped, "What?" The old woman's eyes were shadowed, her face unreadable. She said, "You must finish what your mother started." Evelyn's heart pounded. "Feed it." The whispering turned feverish, desperate. The plants swayed hungrily, reaching, curling toward her. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps. She whispered, "I can't." The boy's hand twitched. His fingers grasped her wrist, cold, impossibly strong. "You can!" Evelyn screamed. The garden pulsed, drinking in the sound. She wrenched herself free, falling backward into the damp soil. The boy clawed his way further from the earth, his hollow gaze locked onto hers. The plants hissed. Mrs. Calloway took a slow step forward. She said, "It must take something, or it will take everything." Evelyn's hands clenched around the shears. She stared at the boy, at his thin, ruined body wrapped in roots. Her past was rising from the dirt, and she had to choose. The wind shrieked, ripping through the yard. The garden convulsed. The boy opened his mouth. Black soil poured from his lips, spilling over the roots, thick and wet. Evelyn. She raised the shears. Her hands trembled. She whispered, "I'm sorry." And then, she made her choice. The garden swallowed the sound of the shears snapping shut. A terrible silence followed, thick and suffocating. Evelyn's breath shuddered as she stumbled back, her fingers numb around the cold metal. The boy's head lolled to the side. His hollow eyes bore into hers, unreadable, black as the earth that had cradled him for years. Then his body gave a slow, unnatural shudder. The roots tightened around him, twisting, pulling. His lips parted, and the soil in his mouth turned to dust. "You finally remember." Evelyn felt the weight of his words press against her ribs. A memory, buried deep, clawed its way to the surface. A summer afternoon, sunlight filtering through the trees, laughter, her own, a boy's voice, younger than hers, calling her name. A promise broken, a hand slipping from her grasp, a small body sinking beneath the earth. Evelyn's vision blurred. The boy was disappearing, sinking into the tangled mess of roots that had claimed him once before. The whispers rose in a haunting symphony, the plants shivering in approval. The garden trembled, feeding, satisfied. Mrs. Calloway exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath. She murmured, "It is done." Evelyn's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping. The air smelled of rotting leaves, of wet soil, of something ancient and hungry. Her voice was raw. "What did I do?" Mrs. Calloway's eyes darkened. She said, "You gave the garden what it needed." Evelyn shook her head violently. She gasped, I just... But she couldn't finish the sentence, because deep inside she knew the truth. The garden had always needed something, and her mother had always provided. She thought of the whispers in the dark, of the plants curling toward her window, of the way the soil had felt warm beneath her bare feet as a child. She had played here, oblivious, while something had been buried beneath her. And now the garden was full. The air shifted. The vines, once writhing hungrily, settled. The shadows stretched, relaxed. The whispers faded to a low hum, like a satisfied sigh. Evelyn's stomach churned. Her voice was barely a breath. "I need to go." Mrs. Calloway said nothing. Evelyn pushed herself up, her legs shaking. She turned toward the house, the glow of the porch light spilling onto the overgrown path. She had to leave, had to get away from the soil beneath her feet, from the whispers pressing against her skull. But as she reached the back steps, she hesitated, because the house had changed. The windows, dark and hollow, seemed deeper than before. The porch light flickered, weak and unsteady. The air smelled different, like wet earth seeping into the walls. She swallowed hard. Her whisper was barely audible. "What's happening?" Mrs. Calloway's voice was steady. She said, "The garden remembers you now." Evelyn turned slowly, her breath shallow. The old woman stood at the edge of the garden, her silhouette sharp against the restless shadows. The vines curled around her feet, winding up her legs like they were a part of her. Her voice was calm, final. She said, "And it does not let go." Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. The garden's presence pressed against her, heavy and suffocating. The whispers slithered through the air, wrapping around her mind like creeping vines. She turned back to the house, gripping the door handle with trembling fingers. It felt colder than it should have. The moment she pushed it open, a damp gust of air met her, thick with the scent of moss and decay. Inside, the walls seemed darker, as if the shadows had deepened. The wooden floors groaned beneath her weight. Her mother's old chair sat in its usual place in the living room, but it was covered in something thin, tangled roots curling over the armrests, reaching toward the floor. Her stomach lurched. The house wasn't just changing, it was being consumed. A sound behind her made her freeze. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. She turned. Mrs. Calloway stood just beyond the threshold, her face unreadable. She said, "It's already begun." Evelyn's voice was hoarse. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Calloway stepped forward, crossing into the house. She said, "You have always belonged to the garden, and now it will take what is owed." Evelyn shook her head. She whispered, No, I didn't ask for this." The old woman gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. She murmured, "Neither did your mother." But she knew. Evelyn's breath hitched. The memories swarmed her. The way her mother had tended the soil with quiet devotion. The way she had warned Evelyn never to step beyond the garden's reach at night. The way she had always seemed afraid. Mrs. Calloway took another step closer. She said, "Your mother kept it satisfied for years, and now it is your turn." Evelyn's knees weakened. The garden had fed on secrets, on the things buried deep beneath the soil. And now that she had remembered, now that she knew, it wouldn't let her leave. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with damp earth. She could feel it, the garden's presence creeping beneath the floorboards, curling through the cracks in the foundation. The whispers swelled, urgent and knowing. The vines at the windows writhed, their shadows stretching across the walls. The roots that had claimed the boy were still hungry. She turned to Mrs. Calloway, desperation clawing at her throat. She pleaded, "Tell me how to stop it." The old woman tilted her head, eyes glinting in the dim light. She said, "You can't stop it. You can only choose." Evelyn swallowed hard. She rasped, "Choose what?" Mrs. Calloway stepped closer. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, and for the first time, Evelyn noticed something, her feet. The way they sank just a little too deeply into the wood, as if the house was swallowing her, or as if she had already been claimed. The old woman's voice was quiet, almost kind. She said, "Who will it take? You or someone else?" Evelyn's stomach lurched. She choked out, "No, I won't, I can't." Mrs. Calloway sighed, shaking her head. She murmured, "Then it will decide for you." A sudden movement caught Evelyn's eye. The walls pulsed. The vines shuddered. The house let out a deep, groaning breath. It was waking up. The house trembled, the floor shifting beneath Evelyn's feet as if something vast and unseen was stirring below. The whispers had become voices now, layered and overlapping, calling her name in familiar tones, her mother, her father, even the boy who had vanished beneath the soil. Evelyn's hands clutched at the doorframe. She said, "I won't let it take me." Mrs. Calloway watched her with something almost like pity. She said, "Then give it what it wants." The walls groaned. The roots slithered up Evelyn's legs, wrapping around her ankles, tugging her toward the hungry earth. She gasped, twisting, trying to break free. But they were too strong. Her mind spun. A sacrifice. That's what her mother had done. That's why the garden had remained quiet for so long. She had fed it. Evelyn's eyes darted toward Mrs. Calloway. She whispered, "You knew. You let this happen." The old woman didn't deny it. She said, "I tried to warn you." The garden pulsed beneath them, the roots tightening, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. Evelyn's heart pounded. If she didn't choose, the garden would take whoever it wanted. It might take her. It might take. Her breath caught. She knew what she had to do. Evelyn took a slow, shuddering breath. The roots squeezed tighter, pulling her down inch by inch. The garden's hunger was relentless. It had waited long enough. Mrs. Calloway watched her with calm acceptance, as if she already knew what Evelyn would do. Evelyn whispered, "You fed it once too, didn't you?" The old woman's expression didn't change, but the slightest flicker of something, guilt, crossed her face. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. She said, "Then you understand." Before Mrs. Calloway could react, Evelyn lunged. She grabbed the frail woman's wrist and yanked her forward. Mrs. Calloway gasped, her eyes wide. She said, "No," but the garden had already decided. The roots released Evelyn and surged toward the old woman, wrapping around her limbs, dragging her down. She struggled, her thin hands clawing at the floor, but it was useless. The shadows swallowed her whole. The house fell silent. The whispers faded. The air grew still. Evelyn staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gulps. The vines on the walls loosened. The garden had taken its offering. She turned toward the door, her legs shaking beneath her. As she stepped outside, she felt it, the garden watching, waiting. She had fed it, but hunger always returns, and one day it would call for her again. Let's start with the next story. The rain tapped against the window, soft and rhythmic, like the gentle brush of fingers over piano keys. Nathan sat hunched over the mahogany desk in his cramped apartment, flipping through a pile of old sheet music. He had spent the past year scouring antique stores and estate sales, searching for forgotten compositions, melodies lost to time, waiting to be played again. He had found this particular piece in a dust-covered crate at an auction house. The title was smudged, nearly illegible, but the notes were clear, painstakingly handwritten in ink that had faded to a deep brown. The moment he touched it, a chill had run down his spine, but he had dismissed it as the drafty air of the old building. Now, in the dim glow of his desk lamp, he ran his fingers over the delicate parchment. He whispered, "Who wrote you?" The notes were intricate, weaving together in a way that felt unnatural, yet mesmerizing. Something about the composition unsettled him, but he couldn't place why. His hands itched to play it. He turned to his violin, resting on its stand beside him. It had been his companion for years, his only solace in a world that never quite made sense. Music spoke to him in ways people never could. He lifted the violin, tucked it beneath his chin, and placed the bow against the strings. The first note rang out, low and rich. Then something moved in the corner of the room. Nathan froze. A shadow flickered just beyond the edge of the lamp's glow. He turned his head, but there was nothing there. He exhaled and shook his head. He whispered, "I need sleep." But his fingers tightened around the violin, and despite the unease twisting in his stomach, he pressed the bow down again, drawing out the next note. Then another, and another. The melody poured into the room, haunting and strange, yet devastatingly beautiful. Each note felt alive, vibrating through his bones. And then, a sound, soft at first, barely audible over the music. A rustling, like pages turning on their own. Nathan's hands faltered. The sheet music on the desk fluttered, though there was no breeze. The ink notes shifted, moving as if they were alive. A whisper brushed against his ear. He dropped the violin. It clattered to the floor, the strings humming from the impact. His breath came in shallow gasps. The room was silent, but he was no longer alone. Nathan's pulse hammered against his ribs as he stared at the scattered sheet music on the desk. The ink no longer seemed faded. It was darker now, as though freshly written. The notes swam before his eyes, shifting and twisting, reforming into something new. He whispered, "That's not possible." His fingers trembled as he reached out, tracing one of the symbols. It smeared slightly under his touch, as if the ink had yet to dry. Then, from the darkness beyond the lamp's glow, something moved. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. Nathan turned sharply. His breath hitched. The shadows in the corner had deepened, thick and almost fluid, stretching along the walls like ink bleeding through paper. He took a step back. The floor creaked beneath him. A whisper curled through the air, impossibly close. A voice said, "Play it." Nathan spun around, his heart pounding. The room was empty. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced, trying to grasp some logical explanation. Fatigue, stress, maybe even a hallucination from lack of sleep. He had spent too many nights buried in music, chasing forgotten compositions, losing himself in melodies that felt like they belonged to another time. But this felt different. The violin lay on the floor, the bow resting just beside it. Slowly, he bent down and picked it up, his fingers brushing against the strings. A shiver ran through him. The moment he touched the instrument, the whispering returned. It was faint at first, like the murmur of a distant crowd, but it grew louder, each voice overlapping, forming an eerie, discordant hum. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to throw the violin across the room, to destroy the sheet music, to forget he had ever found it. But his hands betrayed him. His fingers positioned themselves against the strings. His arm lifted the bow. His body moved, not by his own will, but by something else, something unseen, something waiting. And then, without meaning to, he played. The first note rang out, and the room shifted. The shadows trembled. The air grew thick, suffocating, heavy with something ancient. Then, from the darkness, a voice, soft, melodic, yet filled with something cold and unfeeling, whispered, "You are not alone." Nathan's blood ran cold. The whisper did not come from inside his head. It came from the violin. Nathan's grip tightened on the violin as the whisper echoed in his ears. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching like grasping fingers along the walls. The whispering grew louder, no longer a single voice but many, overlapping, rising in a ghostly crescendo. The violin felt ice-cold against his skin. He whispered, "This isn't real," but his fingers moved on their own, pressing against the strings. The bow slid across them in a slow, deliberate motion, drawing out a trembling note that hung in the air like a dying breath. The voices hushed. For a moment, the silence was worse than the whispers. Then a sound, a single violin, playing in the distance. Nathan's stomach twisted. It was the same melody. Somewhere beyond the walls of his apartment, someone, or something, was playing it back to him. The notes were perfect, identical, but they carried something else with them. A weight, a presence. His hands shook as he lowered the violin. The room was stifling, thick with an unseen force pressing in around him. The walls seemed farther away, stretching into darkness. The violin music from beyond continued. It was getting closer. Nathan backed away, his foot knocking against the chair. His pulse hammered in his skull. He wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but his legs refused to move. The air grew colder. Then, just outside his apartment door, the music stopped. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The silence was unbearable. Then, a knock. Soft, measured. Nathan's knees nearly buckled. The knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate raps. His hands clenched into fists. His mind screamed at him not to open the door. Then from the other side, a voice, low, hollow, and chillingly familiar, spoke. "Nathan," it whispered, "let me in." His blood turned to ice. It was his own voice. Nathan's breath hitched. The voice outside the door was his own, distorted, stretched, yet unmistakable. He shook his head violently. No, this wasn't happening. The door creaked, the handle shifting slightly. "Nathan," the voice whispered again, softer this time. "Let me in." His heart pounded so hard it hurt. He took a step back, his knees trembling. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there frozen in fear. Then another sound, not from the door, from behind him. A single note, drawn out on a violin. His entire body snapped toward the source. The violin was still in his hands. His fingers were curled around its neck, the bow trembling in his grasp. He hadn't played that note, and yet the sound lingered in the air, reverberating through the walls. Nathan's stomach twisted. His shadow, cast long against the floor by the dim lamp, didn't move when he did. The door rattled again, harder this time. Nathan turned back just in time to see the handle turning, slow and deliberate. He staggered back. "No," he gasped. "No, no, no." The door burst open. The hallway outside was pitch black, deeper than any darkness he'd ever seen. It wasn't emptiness. It was something else. Something hungry. And then footsteps. Soft, deliberate, stepping out of the abyss. A figure emerged. Nathan's lungs seized. It was him. A perfect copy. His face, his eyes, his trembling hands. But wrong. His doppelganger's skin was waxy, pale like something that had never seen the sun. His lips curled in an almost smile. His eyes, black as ink, locked onto Nathan's. "You shouldn't have played," the copy said. The voice was his, but layered, as if more than one mouth was speaking at once. Nathan's grip tightened on the violin. His pulse roared in his ears. The copy stepped forward. Nathan took a step back. "Stay away," he choked out. The copy only smiled wider. Behind it, in the darkness of the hallway, more figures shifted. More shapes stepping forward. Dozens of them. All of them him. "I don't," Nathan whispered. "I don't understand." The copy tilted its head. "You will." Then the figures lunged. Nathan barely had time to react. The figures rushed toward him, their movements jerky yet impossibly fast, their hollow eyes locked onto him with eerie precision. He stumbled back, gripping the violin like a shield. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming with terror. Then the sound. A single note rang out again, high, piercing, unnatural. It wasn't from him. The violin played itself. The air around him twisted, warping as though the room were bending inward. Nathan felt his body lock in place, his limbs stiffening, as if invisible strings had wrapped around him. The copies of himself froze mid-step. And then, they began to dissolve. Their flesh peeled away like smoke caught in the wind, their features stretching and twisting. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their bodies unraveling into thin, curling strands of shadow. Nathan fell to his knees, his chest heaving. It was over, or so he thought. A whisper curled through the room. Soft, lingering. It came from the violin. Nathan's fingers twitched. His body no longer felt like his own. His hands moved on their own accord, positioning the violin against his shoulder, lifting the bow. "No," he whispered. "Stop." But his body didn't listen. The bow touched the strings. A single, slow note hummed through the air. Nathan's vision blurred. The walls rippled like water. The air turned thick, suffocating. The music continued, his hands guiding it, playing a song he didn't know. A song that had been waiting to be played. Shapes flickered in the darkness. Not just copies of himself this time. Other figures. Shadows in tattered clothing, faces obscured by the swirling void behind them. Dozens. Hundreds. All watching. Nathan's heartbeat slowed, his mind sinking into the music, into something deeper than thought. He understood now. The composition had never been just music. It was an invitation, a summoning, and now he was part of it. Nathan's fingers moved without his will, dragging the bow across the strings in a slow, mournful stroke. The music swelled, its notes thick with sorrow, loss, and something far more sinister. It wasn't just a melody, it was a voice, a command, an unbreakable contract. The figures in the darkness leaned closer, their hollow eyes glistening like wet ink. Their mouths moved, whispering in perfect unison, though no sound came. Nathan felt his throat tighten. His body was no longer his own. A voice slithered into his mind, low and ancient. "Play!" Nathan tried to resist, to pull away, but his hands obeyed something else now. The violin strings thrummed under his touch, weaving a song he had never learned but somehow knew. The walls of the study melted away into endless blackness, the room stretching outward, vanishing into an infinite abyss. He was not alone. The figures surrounding him solidified, their tattered clothes hanging off skeletal frames. They held instruments, violins, cellos, bassoons, antique and rotting, yet they gleamed as if freshly polished. A ghostly orchestra. Nathan's breath shuddered in his chest as he realized the truth. They had played before him. They had found the composition, just as he had, and now they were bound to it. "You will play until the song is complete," the voice coiled through his thoughts. And the song is never complete. Nathan's arm ached as it moved against his will. His fingers pressed the strings harder, the bow dragging with feverish intensity. The tempo quickened, the song reaching a frantic, chaotic peak. The other musicians joined in, their brittle bones cracking as they played. The sound swallowed him whole. Tears burned down Nathan's face. He tried to scream, to beg for release, but his lips refused to move. His body had become part of the composition, another instrument in its endless performance. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the empty chair in front of him, waiting for the next musician to take his place. The music swelled, reaching an unbearable intensity. Nathan's vision blurred, his body trembling as the ghostly orchestra played on. The violin burned in his hands, the strings vibrating with something alive, something ancient. The melody wrapped around him like chains, tightening, pulling him deeper into its grasp. His fingers ached, but they did not stop. His arm felt like it would snap from exhaustion, but the bow kept moving. The music demanded more, consuming him, note by note, breath by breath. The figures around him swayed, their hollow faces frozen in expressions of eternal torment. Their bony hands moved in perfect synchronicity, their instruments shrieking in a harmony that was both beautiful and unbearable. They had played for centuries, and now so would he. Nathan tried to fight. He forced his legs to move, but they were rooted in place. His lungs burned as he tried to scream, but the music swallowed every sound. His body was no longer his own. The song shifted, and with it, his memories. He saw himself, a young boy, practicing his violin in his childhood home. His mother's soft voice encouraging him, his father's proud nods. He saw his first performance, the nervous tremble in his hands, the rush of applause. Then he saw something else, something that was not his memory, yet it lived inside him now. A grand concert hall, candlelit and filled with an audience dressed in funeral black. A different musician stood where he did now, his eyes wild with terror as he played the same cursed melody. The music consumed him, his flesh fading, his body thinning until he was nothing more than a shadow. And then silence. The orchestra waited. The chair in the center stood empty once more. The music would never end. Nathan's body convulsed as the final notes of the movement echoed into nothingness. His fingers twitched, aching to begin again. The violin hummed against his chin, ready to be played. The voice whispered once more. Again. Nathan lifted the bow. Nathan's arm moved against his will, the bow gliding over the violin's strings as the cursed symphony started anew. The music was no longer something he played. It played him. His body had become an instrument, a hollow vessel for the notes that demanded to be heard. The ghostly orchestra joined him again, their spectral fingers moving with mechanical precision. Their faces were frozen, their empty eyes locked onto him as if waiting for something. The melody deepened, twisting in ways that no mortal musician could compose. Nathan's vision blurred, and suddenly, the grand concert hall around him shifted. He was no longer in the candlelit chamber of the forgotten theater. He was standing on a massive stage, surrounded by thousands of shadowed figures. An audience of the damned. Their hollow faces turned toward him, expressionless, waiting. Nathan's breath came in short gasps. His arms trembled. He felt the weight of eternity pressing against him. The music had consumed countless musicians before him, and now it would claim him as well. No, Nathan thought, gripping the violin tighter. He couldn't let this happen. He had to break free. He fought against the pull, forcing his fingers to slow, to stop. Pain shot through his arms as if his bones would shatter under the pressure. The violin strings buzzed angrily, the bow resisting as if alive. The figures in the orchestra turned their heads toward him in unison. The whisper returned, sharper this time. Play! Nathan clenched his jaw. No, he wouldn't be a prisoner to this cursed composition. He focused every ounce of his willpower, forcing his muscles to obey. His fingers froze, halting the song. The moment the music stopped, the world around him trembled. The grand stage cracked beneath his feet. The ghostly audience released a collective, breathless gasp. The members of the orchestra shuddered violently, their bodies flickering like dying flames. Nathan felt something shift in the air. The power that bound him was weakening. But then, the violin in his hand screamed. A piercing note erupted from the instrument, a sound so shrill and unnatural that it made his ears bleed. The strings curled and twisted, latching onto his fingers, embedding themselves into his flesh. Nathan cried out, but the violin played on its own. The symphony had no intention of letting him go. Nathan's scream was drowned out by the wailing of the violin. The strings pulsed like veins, tightening around his fingers, digging into his skin until blood dripped onto the polished wood. The ghostly orchestra had stopped playing, but they did not disappear. Instead, they stood motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto him, waiting. The audience in the grand concert hall remained silent, an ocean of darkened faces stretching into infinity. Then, a single voice whispered through the void. "Play!" Nathan's hands jerked against his will, forcing the bow across the violin. A single note rang out, deep and mournful, vibrating through his bones. The unseen force clawed at his mind, twisting his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the music's grasp. No, Nathan thought. I won't be a part of this. I won't be like them. But the music had other plans. The notes stretched into a melody, sorrowful and haunting. Each sound painted vivid images in his mind, visions of those who had played before him. He saw them in different eras, trapped in different bodies, each one doomed to continue the symphony. Some had tried to resist. He saw their broken forms, their snapped fingers, their shattered violins. Those who fought back were discarded, erased from time itself. Nathan's stomach churned. This wasn't just a curse. It was a cycle, a never-ending performance of suffering. His bow trembled. If he gave in, he would become another forgotten musician, a faceless player in an eternal orchestra. But if he resisted, he would be destroyed. The whispers grew louder. "Play, Nathan. Play!" He squeezed his eyes shut. There has to be a way out. Then something occurred to him. The music thrived on obedience. It consumed those who played perfectly, who followed its every note. But what if he ruined it? His eyes snapped open. The violin burned against his shoulder, the strings humming with an unnatural force, but he had one last chance. Taking a sharp breath, Nathan did something unthinkable. He played the wrong note. The sound that escaped the violin was jarring, a harsh, discordant screech that clashed against the melody. The ghostly orchestra recoiled as if struck, their hollow eyes widening. The air trembled, the unseen audience shifting in restless unease. Nathan's heart pounded. He had broken the rhythm. He had disrupted the pattern. He did it again. The violin shrieked with an off-key wail, a sharp, ugly sound that had no place in the hauntingly beautiful symphony. The ghostly conductor lifted his baton, but his movements faltered. The musicians behind him twitched, their spectral forms flickering as if they were unraveling. "No," the whispers hissed. "Play it right. Play it as it was written." Nathan gritted his teeth. "No," he said through ragged breaths. "I won't." He dragged the bow across the strings with no care for melody, producing a hideous, jumbled mess of notes. The concert hall trembled. The golden chandeliers above rattled violently, casting warped shadows across the endless rows of faceless spectators. The walls began to crack, revealing an abyss of darkness beyond. The whispers turned to screams. "Stop!" Nathan pressed on. His fingers ached, his arms burned, but he refused to let the music claim him. The more he butchered the song, the more the world around him crumbled. The conductor's once regal face twisted in rage, his mouth stretching wide in an inhuman wail. The orchestra dissolved, their forms breaking apart into streaks of darkness. Nathan could feel something pulling at him, trying to rip him away, but he held on. He played until the last remnants of the music shattered, until there was nothing left but silence. The silence was crushing. It pressed against Nathan's ears, thick and suffocating. The golden concert hall had crumbled into darkness, the once grand chandeliers now twisted wreckage on the floor. The faceless audience was gone, leaving behind only rows of broken, splintered seats. Nathan staggered back, his breath ragged. The violin in his hands felt wrong, warped, brittle, as if it had aged centuries in mere moments. He dropped it, and the instrument hit the ground with a hollow, splintering crack. A slow, terrible sound rose from the shadows. Clapping. Nathan turned, his body rigid with fear. The ghostly conductor remained standing on the ruined stage, his skeletal hands coming together in a slow, deliberate applause. His face was no longer the mask of elegant authority it had been before. Now it was sunken, hollow-eyed, and stretched in a grotesque grin. "Well done," the conductor said, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You refused the music. You rejected the gift." Nathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. Was that the only way to escape? The conductor tilted his head. Escape? He stepped forward, descending from the stage, his form flickering like a dying candle. "Oh, my dear boy, you never escaped." Nathan felt the cold weight of realization settle in his chest. His hands were shaking. His vision swam. The darkness around him shifted, twisted, and then the concert hall returned. Whole, unbroken, as if nothing had ever changed. The chandeliers gleamed overhead, the golden walls stretched into endless grandeur. The faceless audience sat silently in their seats, waiting, and in Nathan's hands, the violin was whole again. Nathan's breath hitched as he stared down at the violin, whole and perfect, as if he had never dropped it. The bow rested in his trembling fingers, the weight of it both familiar and crushing. He turned sharply, searching for the exit, but there were no doors, only endless rows of faceless figures waiting. The conductor stood before him once more, his hollow smile widening. "You see now, don't you?" he said. "The music never lets its players go." Nathan shook his head, his pulse hammering. No, I stopped playing. I broke free." The conductor chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You did not break free. You simply turned the page. The symphony continues always." Nathan looked around frantically, but the truth settled deep in his bones. This was no dream, no hallucination. He had become part of the composition, another note woven into the eternal song. The faceless audience leaned forward in anticipation. The air was heavy with silence. The conductor raised his baton. "Again," he commanded. Nathan's hands moved against his will. The violin pressed against his shoulder. The bow slid across the strings, and as the first note rang out, his mind shattered. The forgotten symphony played on. Let's start with the next story. Deep in the heart of the jungle, hidden beneath centuries of tangled vines and shifting earth, lay the tomb of King Asander. Few knew of its existence, and those who did spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of the curse that lingered within. But to Vincent Calloway, a seasoned archaeologist with an insatiable thirst for discovery, curses were nothing more than myths spun to deter the weak-willed. Vincent stood at the edge of a newly unearthed passage, his lantern flickering against the damp stone walls. His team had spent weeks digging through the ruins, uncovering artifacts of gold and jade, but something about this chamber was different. The air was thick, heavy with an unshakable presence. As he stepped forward, his boots scraping against the stone floor, his breath caught in his throat. At the center of the chamber sat an altar, and atop it, something that should not have been. A lantern, made entirely of bones. The handle was a single curved spine, the base a carefully arranged cluster of finger bones, and the frame, a lattice of rib cages, bound together in an intricate, grotesque design. The skull of a child rested atop it, its hollow sockets staring into nothingness. Vincent said, "Incredible. This must be centuries old." He reached out, fingers grazing the brittle surface. A chill spread through his arm, crawling up his spine like unseen fingers pressing into his skin. His assistant, Amelia, shifted nervously beside him. Amelia said, "Dr. Calloway, maybe we should leave it." Vincent scoffed, lifting the lantern with both hands. It was surprisingly light, as if the bones had been drained of their weight, leaving only their essence behind. Vincent said, "This is a relic of immense historical significance. We document it, and then we take it back to the Institute." Amelia hesitated but nodded. The rest of the team exchanged uncertain glances before resuming their work, cataloging the markings on the walls. Vincent held the lantern closer to his lantern light, examining the base. There, etched into the bone, were symbols he didn't recognize. Strange, winding characters that seemed to shift when he looked away. Then he noticed something else, a small indentation, right in the center of the base. A place for a candle. He hesitated. A whisper brushed past his ear, soft and unintelligible. Vincent turned sharply, scanning the chamber. Vincent said, "Did someone say something?" The team paused. Amelia shook her head. Amelia said, "No one said anything." He frowned, brushing off the unease creeping into his thoughts. It was just the atmosphere, the weight of discovery pressing upon him. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small candle and setting it into the indentation. With a single flick of his lighter, the wick caught fire. At first, nothing happened. The flame flickered, casting elongated shadows against the walls. Then the air shifted. The temperature dropped so fast that the breath of every person in the room became visible in an instant. A deep, resonating hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone like a distant, echoing chant. And then they appeared, faint figures, translucent and shrouded in the glow of the lantern's eerie flame. They moved through the chamber, silent yet filled with purpose. Their faces were blurred, their forms twisted, flickering in and out of existence like candlelight in the wind. Amelia gasped, stumbling back. Amelia said, What is that?" Vincent's heart pounded against his ribs, but his scientific curiosity held him still. He took a step forward, watching as the spirits drifted past. Some turned their hollow eyes upon him, their lips moving as if whispering secrets he couldn't hear. Then the humming stopped. The figures froze, and every single one of them turned toward the entrance of the tomb. Vincent swallowed hard. Vincent said, "Why are they all looking at the—" A sound cut through the silence, a deep, dragging noise, like something massive pulling itself across stone. One of the figures, the tallest among them, raised its hand, pointing toward the darkness beyond the chamber. And then it spoke, its voice hollow and layered, as if 100 voices whispered in unison. Spirit said, "You have called it." Amelia grabbed Vincent's arm, her voice barely a breath. Amelia said, "We need to leave. Now." But Vincent couldn't move. His eyes were locked onto the entrance, where the darkness seemed to swell, shifting and curling as something massive began to stir. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The spirits, once ghostly and serene, began to wither, their forms distorting as if something was pulling them apart. And then, from the depths of the tomb, it emerged. A massive, slithering shape oozed from the darkness, its body dragging across the stone floor with a wet, sickening scrape. The shadows clung to it, shifting and writhing as though alive. Its form was impossible to fully comprehend. Too many limbs, too many faces, shifting and melting into each other like wax dripping from a candle. The air grew thick with the scent of decay. Amelia's grip on Vincent's arm tightened, her nails digging into his skin. Amelia said, "Vincent, put it out. Put the lantern out." Her voice was barely more than a strangled whisper, but Vincent didn't move. He couldn't. His entire body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer wrongness of the thing unfolding before them. The spirits, their translucent forms flickering like dying flames, recoiled from the entity. Some tried to flee, but the thing reached out, long, grasping appendages that shifted between skeletal and fleshy, and pulled them in. Their silent screams echoed through the chamber, and in an instant they were gone. Devoured. The entity turned its many, writhing heads toward the group. Hollow sockets and gaping mouths stretched open impossibly wide, an abyss of endless hunger. A voice slithered through the room, deep and layered, crawling into their ears like insects burrowing beneath the skin. The entity said, "You have opened the door." Vincent's breath came in shallow gasps. His hand trembled as he reached for the lantern. If lighting it had brought this thing forth, then maybe, just maybe, extinguishing it would send it back. His fingers closed around the candle's base. He blew sharply. Nothing happened. The flame flickered, but did not die. Instead, it burned brighter, the wax untouched, as if feeding on something unseen. Amelia sobbed, backing away as the entity dragged itself forward. The rest of the team was paralyzed, staring in mute horror. One of them, Julian, turned and bolted for the entrance. Julian said, "I'm getting out of here." He didn't make it far. The entity moved too fast, too fluidly for something so massive. A tendril shot out, wrapping around Julian's torso. He barely had time to scream before he was yanked backward, disappearing into the creature's shifting mass. His body crumpled inward, folding in ways no human body should. And then he was gone. Amelia screamed. Amelia said, "Vincent, do something." Vincent's mind raced. He had to think, had to find a way to undo whatever had been set in motion. His eyes darted to the symbols etched into the base of the lantern. They twisted, changing before his eyes, forming new words in a language he somehow understood. "The lantern demands a soul," Vincent said. "A soul. It needs a soul to close the door." Amelia's face twisted in horror. Amelia said, "What does that mean?" The entity inched closer, its many mouths stretching wider. Shadows clung to its form, unraveling like tendrils of smoke, reaching for them. Vincent knew what it meant. Something had to be sacrificed. But who? His pulse thundered in his ears. His mind screamed for a way out, a loophole, anything that wouldn't mean. The lantern's flame flared, casting jagged shadows against the walls. The entity paused, its many faces twisting toward the light. It feared the lantern. No, it obeyed it. That's when Vincent realized. It didn't need just any soul. It needed the soul of the one who lit it. His own. Vincent swallowed hard. Vincent said, "There's only one way to stop this." Amelia shook her head violently. Amelia said, "No. No, Vincent, don't." But he knew. There was no other way. If he didn't act now, the entity would consume them all. Slowly, he lifted the lantern, feeling the heat of its unnatural flame against his skin. He took a deep breath, staring into the shifting abyss of the creature before him. And then he stepped forward. Vincent stepped forward, his grip tightening around the bone lantern. The entity loomed over him, its many faces stretching and twisting in grotesque mockery of human expressions, grinning, weeping, snarling. Its massive form pulsed like a living wound, its limbs shifting between flesh and bone. Vincent's breath was shallow. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The lantern's flame burned brighter, casting long, jagged shadows that flickered across the chamber walls. The entity's mouths moved in unison, speaking in a voice that echoed from deep within the tomb. The entity said, "You are the offering." Vincent's entire body tensed. He could feel something pulling at him, something unseen, dragging at the edges of his soul. Amelia's voice broke through the oppressive darkness. Amelia said, "Vincent, stop. We'll find another way." But there was no other way. The words on the lantern had been clear. The one who lights the flame must be the one to quench it. Vincent took another step forward, raising the lantern high. The entity flinched, recoiling slightly as the glow illuminated its shifting form. It hesitated, as if uncertain, as if waiting. Vincent said, "If I give myself to you, will you leave them alone?" The voices layered within the entity murmured in strange, ancient tongues, a chorus of whispers and groans. Then one voice, louder than the rest, spoke. The entity said, "Your soul, in exchange for their freedom." Vincent's heart pounded. He turned to Amelia. Her eyes were wide, her face streaked with tears. Amelia said, "Please don't do this." Vincent gave her a weak smile. Vincent said, "Take the others. Get out of here. Tell the world what we found, and never come back." Before she could protest, he turned back to the entity and did the only thing left to do. He blew out the lantern's flame. The moment the flame extinguished, an icy wind howled through the chamber. The air itself seemed to shatter, darkness crashing down like a tidal wave. The entity surged forward, its many hands reaching, grasping, devouring. Vincent felt the cold sink into his bones. His vision blurred, his body no longer his own. The last thing he saw was Amelia screaming his name, her form growing distant, as though she were being pulled away, or maybe he was. And then nothing. Blackness. Silence. The world was gone. Vincent drifted in endless darkness, his body weightless, his mind unraveling. There was no ground beneath him, no air to breathe, only the cold grip of something vast and ancient coiling around his soul. Then a voice. Not one, but many, whispering, groaning, weeping. The entity said, "You belong to us now." Vincent tried to speak, but his voice was gone. He reached out, but his hands were no longer his own. His fingers had stretched into something long, thin, brittle, like bones. He looked down at himself, but there was no body, only the shifting outline of something hollow, something broken. He was no longer Vincent. He was part of them. Far above, a faint light flickered, distant, golden. The lantern. It still existed. It was still in the world above. A scream echoed through the void. Amelia. She hadn't left. Amelia stumbled backward as Vincent's body collapsed into the dust, his features fading, his skin turning to wisps of shadow before vanishing completely. The entity shuddered, its mass convulsing, and then, as if satisfied, it withdrew, slinking back into the darkness of the tomb. For a moment, there was silence. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the tomb seemed to lift. But something was wrong. The lantern, Vincent's lantern, was still there. Its flame had been extinguished, but the carvings on its surface glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Amelia stepped forward, her breath shallow. Amelia said, No, this isn't over." She knelt, her trembling hands reaching for the lantern. The moment her fingers brushed the bone surface, a whisper curled around her ear. Vincent's voice. Vincent said, "Run." Her blood turned to ice. She turned, grabbing the professor and the others, dragging them toward the tunnel that led back to the surface. The walls trembled, the shadows creeping closer, reaching for them. As they fled, the lantern pulsed one last time, its glow fading into the depths of the tomb. The expedition never spoke of what happened that night. Amelia never returned to the tomb. She never touched another artifact. She left archaeology behind, but she never forgot, because sometimes, in the dead of night, she could still hear the whispers. And in the darkness of her room, on the coldest nights, a faint golden glow flickered, like the light of a lantern that had never truly gone out. Amelia ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pulled Professor Caldwell and the others toward the tunnel. The walls trembled around them, dust and loose stones cascading from above, as if the tomb itself were trying to bury them alive. Behind them, the darkness pulsed, shifting like a living thing. Whispers curled through the air, a chorus of voices rising and falling, their words unintelligible but filled with unbearable sorrow. Caldwell stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock. Amelia turned, grabbing him before he could hit the ground. Amelia said, "Come on, we have to move." But Caldwell's eyes were wide, his face drained of color. He was staring past her, back toward the chamber where Vincent had vanished. Caldwell said, "Do you hear them?" Amelia didn't answer. She didn't want to listen. She just wanted to escape. Nathan and Oliver were ahead of them now, scrambling up the slope toward the narrow passage they had entered through. The light from the surface was still far away, but it was there, a beacon of hope. Then a sound. Not the whispers. Something else. A deep, wet thud. Amelia stopped. It came again. A slow, deliberate step. Something was following them. Nathan turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Nathan said, "It's coming." The tunnel behind them was still filled with blackness, but within that blackness, something moved. A shape, no, several, emerging from the void. The spirits. They were no longer just whispers. They were coming. Oliver screamed and bolted forward, disappearing into the tunnel ahead. The others followed, adrenaline overpowering the fear. Amelia pushed Caldwell forward, urging him on as the air grew colder, as the whispers turned to wails. The passage narrowed, forcing them to crawl. Stones scraped against Amelia's hands and knees, but she didn't stop. She could feel it behind her, them. Closer, closer. Then a hand. Cold, brittle, bony. It wrapped around her ankle. Amelia screamed. She kicked wildly, twisting, her flashlight slipping from her grip and clattering against the rocks. The hand was pulling her back, dragging her toward the darkness. Caldwell turned, grabbed her wrist, and yanked. For a moment, the pull from both sides nearly tore her apart. Then, with a final desperate kick, she broke free. She didn't look back. She crawled forward as fast as she could, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. Then suddenly, air. Cool, fresh air. The exit. Nathan and Oliver were already outside, their faces pale in the moonlight. Caldwell stumbled out next, collapsing onto the sand. Amelia scrambled out last, rolling onto her back, gasping. The tomb entrance was still open. The passage gaped before them, waiting. And from within, a faint, flickering glow. The lantern, still burning, still calling. The glow pulsed from deep within the tunnel, casting long, twisted shadows along the stone walls. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, pressing against Amelia's ears, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Nathan stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance. His voice was barely above a whisper. Nathan said, "It's still burning." Oliver shook his head violently, stepping backward. Oliver said, "We're done. We're done. We need to leave before that thing, before they come back." Professor Caldwell, still on his hands and knees, stared at the entrance with a dazed expression. His glasses were gone, lost in the frantic escape. His voice was weak, trembling. Caldwell said, "We never should have touched it." Amelia's breath came fast, uneven. She wanted to run, to put as much distance as possible between them and the tomb. But something held her in place. A terrible realization settled in her mind like a stone sinking into deep water. She said, "Vincent." The others turned to her. She said, "We left him down there." Oliver's face twisted in anger and fear. Oliver said, "He's gone, Amelia. You saw what happened. There's nothing left of him." Caldwell pushed himself up, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. His voice was hoarse. Caldwell said, "We don't know that." Nathan swallowed hard, glancing at the tomb entrance. Nathan said, "Even if he's alive, how would we get him out? We barely made it." The wind picked up, sweeping across the dunes, filling the air with dry, whispering sand. Then a sound, a voice, faint, muffled, from inside the tomb. Vincent said, "Help me." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. It was him. She turned, staring into the black tunnel, the glow of the lantern flickering deep inside. Nathan whispered, "No way." Oliver took another step back, shaking his head. Oliver said, "That's not possible." The voice came again, weaker this time. Vincent said, "Please, I'm still here." Caldwell stood slowly, his eyes locked on the tunnel. Caldwell said, "If he's still alive." Oliver cut him off, his voice rising in panic. Oliver said, "Don't you get it? That thing is still down there. That's not Vincent." The wind howled around them, sweeping sand over their boots. The night pressed in, thick and suffocating. Amelia clenched her fists. The smart choice was to leave, to run and never look back. But if there was even a chance Vincent was alive. She turned to Nathan. She said, "I'm going back in." Nathan's face went pale. Nathan said, No. She said, "You don't have to come. But I have to know." Caldwell took a deep breath and nodded. Caldwell said, "I'll go with you." Oliver cursed under his breath, looking between them and the tomb. Oliver said, "You're both insane." Nathan hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Nathan said, "Damn it. Fine. But we go fast." Oliver groaned, but didn't argue. Amelia turned back to the tunnel, her heart pounding. The glow of the lantern still flickered in the darkness, waiting. Then slowly she stepped forward, back into the tomb. The descent felt longer this time. Every step deeper into the tomb made the air heavier, pressing against Amelia's chest like unseen hands. The lantern's glow pulsed in the distance, casting strange, flickering shapes along the rough walls. The tunnel was quieter than before. No whispers, no shifting shadows, just the weight of their own breathing and the crunch of sand beneath their boots. Nathan's voice was tight, barely above a whisper. Nathan said, "This is a mistake." Caldwell, walking just ahead, didn't look back. Caldwell said, "Maybe. But if Vincent is still alive, we can't leave him." Oliver muttered under his breath. Oliver said, "We shouldn't have come back at all." Amelia ignored them. Her focus was locked on the tunnel ahead, on the faint, pulsing glow. The lantern. And beyond it, "Vincent?" She called out, voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. She said, "Vincent? We're here. Where are you?" Silence. Then a sound. A scraping noise, like something shifting against stone. Vincent's voice came weak, gasping. Vincent said, "Here, please." The sound sent a chill through her bones. It didn't seem to come from one place, but from all around them, bouncing off the walls in ways that didn't feel natural. Caldwell pressed forward, his breath quick. Caldwell said, "Stay close." They reached the central chamber. The lantern sat in the middle of the room, its glow softer now, more contained. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching in ways that made Amelia's stomach twist. And then she saw him, Vincent. He was slumped against the far wall, his face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked wrong, like something had drained him, hollowed him out. His skin was stretched too tightly over his face, his lips dry and cracked. Amelia rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. She said, "Vincent, we're here, we're getting you out." His eyes flickered toward her, but something was off. His pupils were too large, swallowing most of the color. His fingers twitched at his sides. Vincent said, "It's still here." Nathan and Oliver hovered near the entrance, shifting uneasily. Caldwell knelt beside Amelia, studying Vincent with sharp eyes. Caldwell said, "What happened? What did you see?" Vincent licked his dry lips, his breathing shallow. Vincent said, I don't know. It spoke to me. It showed me things I wasn't meant to see." Oliver shifted, glancing nervously at the lantern. Oliver said, "We need to leave. Now." Vincent's hand shot out, grabbing Amelia's wrist with surprising strength. Vincent said, "Don't touch the lantern." She stiffened. She said, "What?" Vincent shook his head, his grip tightening. His voice was desperate now, urgent. Vincent said, "It's not just a light. It's a door." The word sent a shudder through her. Nathan muttered, "What the hell does that mean?" Vincent tried to push himself up, but his body trembled violently. Vincent said, "It's not a lantern. It's a trap." Caldwell frowned. Caldwell said, "For what?" Vincent's mouth opened, but before he could speak, the shadows moved. A deep, guttural noise rose from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere. Something was waking up. Something ancient. Amelia's pulse slammed in her ears as the glow of the lantern suddenly flared, and the chamber was swallowed in shifting darkness. The darkness swallowed the chamber whole. Amelia could still see the lantern's glow, but it was dim now, flickering wildly as if struggling to stay alight. The shadows around them pulsed, thick and shifting, curling along the walls like living tendrils. Then, the whispering returned. Not from a single source, from everywhere. It was different this time. Not just voices, but something else. Something deeper. A sound that wasn't meant for human ears. A slow, shuddering inhale filled the air. Not from Vincent. Not from any of them. From something else inside the tomb. Nathan stepped back, shaking his head. Nathan said, "We need to go. Right now." Vincent still clutched Amelia's wrist, his grip iron-like despite his weakened state. Vincent said, "It won't let us." The whispering rose, twisting into something almost like words. Mocking. Hungry. Caldwell turned toward the entrance. Caldwell said, "Move. Now." Amelia grabbed Vincent under his arms, trying to haul him up. He was too weak, barely able to support his weight. Nathan rushed forward to help, while Oliver and Caldwell backed toward the tunnel. The moment they reached the threshold, the lantern flared again. Not with light, with something else. A presence. A shape rose from the shifting darkness. Not a figure, not a man, but something that had never been human. Tall, writhing, its form blurred at the edges, flickering like fire, twisting in ways that defied logic. Its limbs stretched too far, bending at angles that made Amelia's stomach churn. And its face, if it could be called that, was nothing but a yawning void. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow space that screamed without sound. Vincent convulsed. His body jerked violently as the thing loomed over him, its shifting form reaching toward him like smoke curling through the air. Vincent gasped, "It's inside me." The whispering surged into a deafening roar. Caldwell fired. The gunshot cracked through the tomb, the muzzle flash lighting up the chamber for a split second. The bullet passed straight through the thing, hitting the far wall with a dull thud. It didn't react, didn't even acknowledge it. Then it moved. A flicker, a shift in the air, and it was inches from them. Amelia screamed as the thing's presence pressed against her mind, a feeling like fingers digging into her skull, peeling back her thoughts, pulling her inward. Nathan grabbed the lantern. Nathan said, "Run." The moment his fingers touched it, the light blazed, and the thing recoiled. It didn't vanish. It didn't retreat. But it paused, just for a second, and that was enough. Caldwell grabbed Oliver and shoved him toward the tunnel. Caldwell yelled, "Move." Amelia and Nathan hauled Vincent up and ran. The whispering chased them. The air around them crackled, the walls shook, and the passage narrowed as if the tomb itself was closing in. Something was coming. Something was waking up, and they were running out of time. The tunnel twisted ahead, suffocatingly narrow, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The whispering grew louder, closer, as if the darkness itself had gained a voice. Nathan clutched the lantern, its eerie glow flickering wildly in his hands. Every time the light dimmed, the thing behind them surged forward. Amelia dragged Vincent along, his legs barely moving. His skin was clammy, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't going to last. Vincent whispered, "It's inside me." His voice was barely audible, but Amelia felt the weight of his words sink into her bones. Caldwell shoved Oliver ahead, his pistol still clutched in his hand despite its uselessness. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting to the shifting darkness closing in. Caldwell shouted, "Faster!" Then the tunnel split. Two passages, one veering left, the other sloping downward into deeper darkness. Caldwell didn't hesitate. Caldwell pointed left and said, "That way." Nathan hesitated. Something was wrong. The left passage felt off. Like a trick. A trap. Amelia saw it too. The stones there were too smooth, too perfect, while the right path looked like the rest of the tomb, ancient, untouched. Vincent's grip on her wrist tightened. Vincent whispered, "Not left." Caldwell turned, his face hardening. Caldwell said, "We don't have time to." A horrible, wet sound echoed behind them. A sound that didn't belong in this world. A sound of tearing flesh. Amelia didn't look. She couldn't. Instead, she ran right. Nathan followed, dragging the lantern with him. The others cursed but followed, their boots pounding against the stone. The air grew colder. The whispering grew sharper. Something was wrong. The lantern's glow flickered, then changed. The golden hue drained away, shifting into something sickly and pale. The shadows it cast on the walls twisted, not reflections, but figures. Dozens of them. Oliver gasped, "What the hell is this?" The figures moved, reaching, their skeletal hands grasping at the air. Their faces were blurred, faceless, but their mouths were open, screaming without sound. Nathan tried to pull the lantern away, but it was stuck to his hand. Nathan said, I can't drop it." The air shuddered. And then, the floor collapsed. A sudden, sickening lurch. The ground gave way beneath them, stone and dust tumbling into the void. Amelia felt herself falling, her stomach twisting as she plummeted into the unknown. And then, blackness, silence. A dull ringing filled Amelia's ears. For a moment, she thought she was still falling, plunging endlessly into darkness. But then the pain set in. Her body ached. The taste of dust and blood coated her tongue. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. Something moved beside her. A groan. Amelia whispered, "Nathan?" A weak voice replied, "Here." She forced herself to sit up, wincing as sharp pain shot through her ribs. The lantern lay a few feet away, its glow dim and sickly pale. Vincent coughed, his voice hoarse. "Where are we?" The others groaned, their bodies sprawled across the uneven stone. Oliver was muttering to himself, his hands shaking as he pushed himself up. Caldwell had landed hard, a deep gash across his forehead, but he was alive. Amelia tried to steady her breathing. They were still in the tomb. But this chamber was different. The walls were carved with intricate symbols, ancient markings that seemed to shift when she looked at them. And then she noticed the statues. Lining the edges of the chamber stood figures carved from bone, tall, grotesque things with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Their mouths hung open in silent screams. Nathan reached for the lantern, but the moment his fingers touched it, the whispers returned. Not distant anymore. Right there. Nathan flinched, gripping his head. Nathan whispered, they're speaking to me." Amelia grabbed his wrist. Amelia said, "Don't listen." Nathan's eyes were wide, unfocused, his breath ragged. Caldwell staggered to his feet, his hand pressing against the wound on his forehead. He glanced around, his expression dark. Caldwell muttered, "We need to find a way out." Vincent's voice was barely above a whisper. "We're not alone." Amelia turned, and her stomach dropped. The statues had moved. They were closer now, their hollow eyes fixed on them. Their bony fingers stretched toward the lantern. Oliver choked out, No, that's not possible." Nathan gasped, his voice trembling. "It's them." The lantern flickered wildly, its glow pulsing, and suddenly the statues lurched forward. The whispering turned into screams. A cold hand clamped onto Amelia's arm. She screamed. Caldwell fired his gun, the shot echoing through the chamber, but the statues did not stop. They were awake, and they were hungry. The chamber erupted in chaos. The statues lurched forward, their brittle limbs moving with unnatural speed. Their hollow eyes glowed with a sickly, hungry light. Amelia yanked her arm free, stumbling backward as one of the figures clawed at her. Its fingers scraped her skin, ice cold yet burning. Caldwell fired again, but the bullet passed through the bone, shattering part of the figure's skull. It did not stop. It did not slow. Vincent grabbed Oliver, pulling him back as another figure lunged forward. Vincent shouted, "The lantern! Put it out!" Nathan clutched the lantern, his hands trembling. It was glowing too brightly now. The flickering light cast monstrous shadows on the walls. Nathan gasped, I can't. It won't go out." Oliver whimpered, pressing himself against the far wall. The whispering had grown into a howling wind, rushing through the chamber, filling their ears with 1,000 voices speaking at once. Amelia's mind raced. The lantern had called them. It had brought them back, but it was also their only connection to this world. Amelia shouted, "Smash it!" Nathan hesitated. Amelia grabbed a rock and swung with all her strength. The lantern shattered. For a second, nothing happened. Then the light died. The chamber fell silent. The whispering stopped. The statues froze in place. And then, one by one, they crumbled to dust. Amelia gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The others stood motionless, staring at the pile of brittle bones scattered across the floor. Caldwell muttered, "Is it over?" A deep, rumbling sound filled the air. The walls began to shift. Oliver whimpered, "The tomb, it's collapsing." Dust rained from above. The carvings on the walls bled darkness, the symbols unraveling as if the tomb itself was coming undone. Vincent grabbed Amelia's arm. Vincent shouted, "Run!" They bolted. The floor trembled beneath their feet, shaking violently as the tomb's ancient stones cracked and splintered. A low, guttural roar echoed from deep within the walls, and the ceiling groaned, threatening to collapse. Vincent pushed Amelia forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pulled Oliver behind him. Caldwell was already several steps ahead, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he scrambled toward the exit. Nathan was still carrying the shattered remains of the lantern, though now the bones had fallen silent. He stumbled, his face pale, the weight of everything pressing on him. Amelia cried out, "Hurry! We can't stop now." They reached the entrance, but the massive stone door had shifted, now blocked by debris. The only way out was through the narrow tunnel they had come from, but the walls had begun to collapse even there. Nathan pulled Amelia back as a huge section of the ceiling fell directly in front of them. He gasped, "We're trapped." Amelia's mind raced. She could hear the roar of the tomb, its terrible hunger growing louder. She turned to Vincent, who was already pulling at the debris, trying to move it. Vincent shouted, "Get to the tunnel. I'll hold it open." They didn't argue. They had no choice. They squeezed through the narrow gap, the dust choking them, the air thick with the stench of rotting bone and decay. Caldwell made it first, shouting, "Come on." One by one, they crawled through the tunnel, the walls closing in behind them. The ground beneath their hands was slick with moisture, and the air grew colder, heavier. They didn't stop. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around them, suffocating and relentless. Their breathing was ragged, desperate. The distant roar of the tomb echoed, a sound that threatened to drive them mad with fear. The ground beneath them was slick with the moisture of ancient, forgotten secrets, and every step seemed to drag them deeper into the bowels of the earth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. A shaft of moonlight filtered down through cracks in the stone, casting long shadows across the floor. It was silent here, almost too silent. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the faint rustling of bones shifting in the distance. They paused, looking back at the narrow tunnel they had just crawled through, but no one spoke. Nathan stood still, holding the remnants of the bone lantern in his hands, now completely shattered. His eyes were wide, haunted, and his hands trembled. He knew they had barely escaped. But what was left? Oliver's voice broke the silence, shaking. What happens now?" Vincent turned, his face pale, but his voice steady. We survive. And we forget. Forget. Amelia's voice cracked, barely a whisper. How can we forget? What we saw, what we heard. Because, Vincent said, his eyes cold and distant now, if we don't, it will never end. The wind howled from the depths of the tomb, but in that chamber, it was oddly quiet. They were free for now, but the lantern had been left behind, and the spirits it had unleashed were never truly gone. As they walked away from the tomb, the darkness seemed to follow them, but they never spoke of the lantern again. They would carry the weight of its curse with them for the rest of their days, forever haunted by the ghosts they had awakened. And in the quiet moments, when the wind howled at night or when the shadows grew long, they would hear it, the distant bone lantern's call. And then, just as the fog settled and the whispers faded, they would try to forget. But deep inside, they knew it would never truly be over. Let's start with the next story. Dr. Henry Caldwell was not the kind of man to believe in superstitions. As a scientist, he relied on facts, logic, and evidence. His life was dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of nature, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to uncover. It started on a cold autumn afternoon in the archives of Blackwood University. Henry had been sifting through ancient medical records for his research when he came across a leather-bound journal. The book was old, far older than the documents surrounding it. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, and the cover bore no title. Intrigued, he opened it and immediately noticed the elegant but hurried handwriting of someone long dead. October 13th, 1837. The experiment is ready. We have followed every step, every calculation, and yet I hesitate. If our theories are correct, we are not merely calling upon forces we do not understand. We are inviting something into our world. Henry furrowed his brow. This was not a medical journal. As he flipped through the pages, his curiosity grew. The entries described a secret experiment conducted nearly 2 centuries ago by a group of scientists whose names he did not recognize. The details were vague, but the intent was clear. They had attempted to summon something. He muttered, "Summon what?" The pages hinted at an entity, something beyond human comprehension. The researchers had drawn symbols, spoken incantations, and performed rituals, all in the name of science. But then, the entries stopped abruptly. No conclusion. No results. Just a single phrase scrawled hastily on the last page. "It watches from the dark. We were wrong to call it." A chill crept up Henry's spine. He had spent his entire career dismissing supernatural claims, but something about this journal unsettled him. He had to know more. He took the journal home that evening, placing it on his desk under the harsh glow of his desk lamp. The words swam in his mind, refusing to let him rest. After several hours of research, he found a single reference to the experiment buried in a forgotten newspaper article from 1840. It mentioned a fire that destroyed an old laboratory near Blackwood University. All occupants were presumed dead, but no bodies had ever been recovered. Henry whispered, "No bodies?" He turned back to the journal, scanning the pages for anything he might have missed. That was when he noticed something strange, a passage that hadn't been there before. "You are reading this. That means you found us." His breath caught in his throat. He ran his fingers over the ink. It was dry, aged like the rest of the writing, yet he was certain he had not seen those words earlier. He closed the journal, his hands shaking. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A flicker of darkness in the far corner of the room. He turned quickly, but nothing was there. The lamp buzzed faintly. The shadows cast by his furniture seemed deeper than before, stretching unnaturally toward him. Henry shook his head. Get a grip. He blamed exhaustion, overwork, maybe even an overactive imagination. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. He had opened something long forgotten, and something or someone had noticed. Henry told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had spent too long reading eerie words from a long-dead scientist, and now he was letting them get to him. He closed the journal, pushed his chair back, and rubbed his temples. He muttered, "Enough for tonight." The room was quiet except for the faint hum of his desk lamp. He stood up, stretched, and turned toward the door, then stopped. His shadow was still seated. His breath hitched. For a moment, he thought it was just a strange trick of the light, but as he stepped back, the shadow did not move with him. It remained hunched in his chair, perfectly still. Henry whispered, "What the hell?" His mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but his body acted on instinct. He lunged for the light switch and flipped it. The room was swallowed in darkness. His heart pounded as he stood there waiting. When he turned the light back on, the shadow was gone. A heavy silence filled the air. He let out a shaky breath, forcing a laugh. Too much work, Henry. Too much damn work. He left the journal on the desk and went to bed. But sleep did not come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words from the last entry. "It watches from the dark. We were wrong to call it." And then the dream came. He was standing in a dimly lit room. Candles flickered against stone walls covered in symbols. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of something rotten. A group of figures in dark robes stood in a circle, whispering. At the center was an old wooden door, its surface scratched and battered. One of the figures turned. Its face was wrong, blurred, shifting, like something that couldn't quite exist in this world. It raised a hand and pointed at him. A voice echoed, distorted and hollow. "You read the words. You brought it back." The door creaked. A low growl rumbled from the other side. Henry jolted awake. His breath came in short gasps, his sheets damp with sweat. He sat up, running a trembling hand through his hair. "Just a dream," he whispered. But then, something shifted in the corner of the room. The darkness wasn't just darkness anymore. It was moving. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The darkness in the corner was not just a trick of his tired eyes. It pulsed, shifting like thick smoke, curling along the edges of the room. The air grew heavy, suffocating. A deep, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a whisper, echoed from within. Henry forced himself to move. He scrambled for the bedside lamp, nearly knocking it over as he fumbled with the switch. The light flickered on, spilling a dim glow across the room. The darkness recoiled. It slithered back, vanishing into the farthest corner as if it had never been there. Henry sat frozen, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but all he could think about was the journal. He whispered, "The experiment." He swung his legs over the bed, hesitant to place his feet on the floor. He half expected something to reach out from the shadows beneath him. When nothing did, he stood, moving cautiously toward his desk. The journal was still there, sitting exactly where he left it. He picked it up, his hands unsteady as he flipped to the last entry. "It watches from the dark. We were wrong to call it." Henry's breath trembled. His gaze darted to the sketches in the margins. Strange, jagged symbols surrounded a crude drawing of a door. The same door from his dream. "No," he thought. "This is just my mind playing tricks on me. I'm sleep deprived, stressed." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. A sudden knock at the front door made him jump. The sound was sharp, urgent. He glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Henry whispered, "Who the hell?" Another knock. Louder this time. He hesitated before stepping out of his room, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The hallway was dark, but something about the shadows felt wrong. They seemed deeper, stretching farther than they should. He reached the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch light revealed an empty doorstep. Henry swallowed hard. Then, just as he was about to step away, something moved at the very edge of the porch light's reach. A figure, tall, thin, standing just beyond where the light could fully reveal it. The knock came again. A voice followed, low and distorted. "Let me in." Henry's breath caught in his throat. The voice was his. Henry's skin prickled with cold terror. The voice on the other side of the door had been his. Every inflection, every subtle tone, exactly as if he had spoken the words himself. He took a step back. The figure outside did not move. It stood just beyond the porch light's reach, its form shifting, indistinct, as if it wasn't entirely solid. Henry's mind raced. This isn't real. It can't be real. The voice came again. This time softer, almost coaxing. Henry's own voice said, "You invited me. You opened the door." Henry whispered, "No, I didn't. The journal. The experiment. The door in his dream. We were wrong to call it." He clenched his jaw. His hands were trembling. He forced himself to take another step back. A sound, barely audible, scraped along the bottom of the door. A dragging, scratching noise. Then a whisper. Henry. His name, spoken in a breath that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He turned and bolted back to his room, slamming the door behind him. His lungs burned as he gasped for air. He grabbed the journal again, flipping frantically through the pages, searching for something, anything, that could tell him how to stop this. The sketches of the door, the symbols, the last frantic entry. It watches from the dark. We were wrong to call it. It is no longer waiting. The last line struck him like ice down his spine. It walks among us now. Henry's lamp flickered. The shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, twisting and curling like ink spilled in water. A slow creaking sound filled the room. His closet door was opening. A whispering breath, his own voice, echoed from inside. "Let me out." Henry's breath caught in his throat. His closet door was opening, inch by inch, revealing only darkness beyond. It was an impossible darkness, deeper than the room's shadows, more consuming than the night outside. "Let me out," the voice whispered again. His voice. His legs refused to move. His body was frozen, trapped between terror and disbelief. The journal trembled in his hands. It isn't real. It can't be real. Then something shifted in the darkness. A shape, a figure, a hand, thin and too long, reached from the void, gripping the edge of the closet door. Its fingers curled inward, pressing against the wood, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it began pulling itself forward. Henry's own voice whispered from within, "You brought me here." He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his chair. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. His room, once familiar and safe, had become a trap. The figure took another step forward, its outline wrong, warped, shifting, flickering like a broken film reel. It was him. No, not him. Something else, something wearing his face, his form, but stretched and unnatural. Its eyes were pits of emptiness, its mouth curling into something that might have been a smile, if smiles were meant to terrify. "Don't be afraid," it said in his voice. "You already opened the door." The words hit Henry like a hammer. His dream, the experiment, the journal, the warnings. We were wrong to call it. The thing took another step. Henry grabbed the lamp from his desk and hurled it forward. The glass shattered against the floor, and the room plunged into darkness. And in that darkness, the whispering surrounded him. "You can't close the door now." Then the light flickered back on. The figure was gone, but the closet door remained open, and from within, something was breathing. Henry's body trembled as he backed away from the closet. His heart pounded, so hard it felt like it would break through his ribs. The breathing in the darkness was steady, slow, deliberate. It was waiting. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But some part of him, the rational part, forced him to think. The experiment. It wasn't just a theory. It wasn't just forgotten notes from the 1800s. It was real. And worse, it was unfinished. His mind raced through the journal's last pages. Dr. Whitmore and his team had tried to reverse the summoning. They had failed. The entity had remained trapped, but not destroyed. It will wait in the dark. It will wear your skin. It will whisper in your voice. Henry's voice echoed from the closet once more. "You let me in." No. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't look. Henry spun, grabbing his phone, but his fingers fumbled. The screen was black. It wouldn't turn on. He tapped the power button, swiped at the screen, but nothing responded. Then static. The phone's speaker crackled, warping into a distorted, broken version of his own voice. "Henry," the voice rasped. "Why won't you look at me?" His breath hitched. The closet creaked. The darkness shifted. And then footsteps. Not from inside the closet. Behind him, a shadow stretched across the floor. A perfect silhouette of his own shape, cast by a light that wasn't there. It moved when he didn't. It took a step closer. Henry bolted. He sprinted for the door, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. He twisted it, pounded on the wood, but it refused to open. His own apartment had become a prison. Behind him, the breathing grew louder. Shaking, Henry forced himself to turn. The shadow stood inches away. It was no longer flat against the floor. It had risen, pulled itself into something solid. A figure, identical to him in every way, but its skin was darker than black, shifting like liquid ink. It lifted a hand. Henry's body moved against his will. His own hand mirrored the motion. It grinned. "You're almost ready," it whispered. The lights flickered. And then, darkness. The darkness swallowed everything. Henry couldn't see his hands. He couldn't see the walls. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, but even that sound felt muted, like the darkness itself was absorbing it. Then the whisper came. Almost ready. It was his voice. But it wasn't. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling. This isn't real. This isn't happening. A cold breath brushed against his ear. "You need to see." Henry's eyes snapped open. The room had changed. The walls were no longer lined with bookshelves and notes. The apartment was gone. Instead, he stood in a vast, endless void of black. Shapes moved within it, slow and fluid, like ink dissolving in water. The only solid thing was the shadow standing before him. It still looked like him, but its grin was wider, unnatural. "They tried to stop it," it said. "They tried to contain it, but they only delayed what was meant to be." Henry's body felt heavy. His arms, his legs, he couldn't move them. It was like the darkness itself was pulling him in, wrapping around him like invisible chains. "You are the key," the shadow continued. "You finished what they started." "No," Henry croaked. I didn't summon anything. I just read the notes." The shadow tilted its head. "That's all it takes," it whispered. Henry's stomach dropped. The ritual. The final words. He had read them aloud, not even thinking. He had spoken them into the air. And the thing had heard. It's been waiting for a voice. A host. And now it's time. The darkness surged forward. Henry tried to scream, but his voice was stolen from his throat. The void rushed in, swallowing him whole. Pain. Cold, sharp pain seared through every inch of his body. It wasn't like being burned. It was like being unmade. Like his skin, his bones, his very existence was unraveling thread by thread. The shadow stepped closer. Henry felt himself pulling apart. "Don't fight it," the voice echoed inside his head. "You were meant for this." And then, silence. The silence stretched endlessly. Henry drifted in the darkness, weightless, thoughtless. The pain had stopped, but something was missing, something vital. His name. He couldn't remember his name. He tried to move, but his body no longer felt real. Instead, there was only the dark, cold space he now existed in. Not floating, not falling, just there. Then, a voice whispered from the void. "It's done." Something shifted. The darkness rippled, pulling away, and suddenly light. Henry blinked. He was standing in his apartment. The desk, the notes, the books, all exactly where they had been. The dim glow of the lamp flickered softly, casting long shadows on the walls. Had it been a dream? His breath came shaky as he lifted a hand to his face. Solid. Real. He swallowed hard and looked down at the papers on his desk. The notes from the experiment were still there. The ritual. The symbols. The warning. His shadow stretched long beside him, flickering unnaturally. Henry turned slowly. It was standing there, a black silhouette, identical to him, but wrong. Its head tilted at an angle that made his stomach twist. The grin on its face was wide, too wide. "It's my turn now," it whispered. Henry tried to move, but his body refused to respond. His hands, his feet, his mouth. He was frozen in place. The shadow lifted a hand, pressing its fingers against his chest. A deep, numbing cold spread through him. "You brought me here," it said, "and now I take your place." Henry's vision blurred. His heartbeat slowed. The room around him seemed to stretch and distort. The last thing he saw was his shadow stepping forward, and the last thing he heard was his own voice whispering, "Goodbye, Henry." Darkness swallowed him whole, and the shadow walked into the light. Let's start with the next story. The moving truck pulled away from the house next door, its tires crunching over the gravel. Mark stood by the window, watching as the last box was loaded. The old neighbor, Mr. Henderson, had been a quiet man, polite but distant. It was strange to think he was really gone. "I hope the new neighbors are normal," Sarah said, joining him at the window. She was holding a cup of coffee, her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "The last thing we need is some weirdos." Mark chuckled. Weirdos would be more entertaining than another Mr. Henderson. Sarah smiled but didn't respond. Something about the empty house made her uneasy. The way it stood so still, its windows dark, as if it were watching them instead of the other way around. That evening, as they were setting the table for dinner, headlights flashed through the front window. A car pulled into the driveway next door. "Looks like they're here," Mark said. They both peered through the curtains. A man stepped out of the car, stretching his arms as if shaking off a long drive. He looked oddly familiar. Sarah frowned. Does he look like Mr. Henderson to you?" Mark let out a breathy laugh. "Come on, that's just in your head. He's probably the same height, same build. But look, he's younger." The man turned slightly, and for a moment his face was caught in the porch light. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The resemblance was uncanny. The same sharp nose, the same tired eyes. Even the way he moved, it was like watching an old recording of their former neighbor, played at a slightly different speed. "Maybe he's related," Mark offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah watched as the man pulled a box from the trunk and walked toward the house. Then, something made her breath hitch. The way he stepped over the first crack in the pavement. The same way Mr. Henderson used to. A small, nagging fear settled into her chest. The next morning, Sarah was making coffee when she saw him again. He was out in the yard, watering the plants. The exact same plants Mr. Henderson had planted. Mark walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Sarah said, "I swear, he's doing the exact same things Mr. Henderson used to do. The way he walks, the way he moves. It's like he studied him." Mark sighed. "Sarah, people are creatures of habit. Maybe Mr. Henderson just had a very standard routine." But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. The new neighbor wasn't just similar to Mr. Henderson. He was identical in every way. Sarah waved at him once while taking out the trash. The neighbor paused, his hand hovering midair, then slowly returned the wave with the exact same hesitation Mr. Henderson had always shown. That night at dinner, she couldn't keep it in anymore. Sarah said, "Something's not right about him." Mark chewed thoughtfully before responding. "Then let's go introduce ourselves. Maybe meeting him will help you relax." Sarah hesitated, but finally agreed. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe she was just imagining things. The next evening, they knocked on the neighbor's door. It opened almost immediately, as if he had been standing right behind it. He smiled. "Hello, neighbors," he said. His voice. It was the same tone, the same inflection. Mark said, "Hey, we just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. We lived next to Mr. Henderson for a while. You wouldn't happen to be related, would you?" The neighbor's smile didn't change. "I've lived here for years," he said. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Mark forced a chuckle. "Oh, well, I guess it just feels like that. Because the last guy lived here so long." The neighbor's head tilted slightly, as if considering the words. "I've always lived here," he repeated. Sarah's fingers dug into Mark's arm. "Oh, okay," Mark said, his smile faltering. "Well, nice meeting you. See you around." The neighbor's eyes followed them as they walked away. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the wind outside. And then she heard it, a soft scraping sound. She turned to Mark, but he was already asleep. Slowly, she sat up and walked to the window. Her breath caught in her throat. The neighbor was standing in his yard, facing their house. But he wasn't just standing. He was mimicking her. His hands rested at his sides in the same position. His head was tilted the same way. Even the way he shifted slightly from foot to foot. It was as if he was copying her movements exactly. Sarah stepped back, her pulse racing. The neighbor did the same. She lifted her hand to her chest. So did he. She turned away. And from outside, she heard a soft, whispered echo. "I've always lived here." The next morning, Sarah felt like she hadn't slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing in the yard, mirroring her movements, whispering those awful words. Mark sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. Sarah said, "We need to talk about the neighbor." Mark sighed, setting his phone down. "Sarah, come on. You're letting this get to you too much." Sarah said, "He was standing outside last night, copying me. Everything I did, he did too." Mark frowned, but didn't look convinced. "Are you sure it wasn't just a shadow? A weird trick of the light?" Sarah snapped. "I know what I saw, Mark." Mark exhaled slowly. "Okay, then let's prove it. Tonight, we'll watch him. Together. If he does anything weird, we'll record it." Sarah hesitated, but finally nodded. That night, they turned off all the lights and sat by the window, watching the house next door. Hours passed. The street was quiet. No movement. Mark sighed. "See? Nothing." But just as he was about to turn away, the neighbor's porch light flickered on. The front door opened. The neighbor stepped outside. He stood perfectly still for a long time, just staring at their house. Then slowly he lifted his arm. Sarah tensed. The neighbor's fingers curled, forming a loose wave. Mark whispered, "He's just standing there." Sarah raised her hand slightly, just an inch. The neighbor copied her, raising his hand by the exact same amount. She turned her head to the left. So did he. Mark's breath hitched. "No way," he whispered. Sarah clenched her fists. "What do you want?" she called out. The neighbor tilted his head, a slow, unnatural movement. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he whispered, "What do you want?" Sarah's heart pounded. Mark grabbed her arm. "Let's go inside. Now." They backed away from the window. Sarah locked the doors, her hands shaking. "Mark, he's not normal. This isn't right." Mark swallowed hard. "Tomorrow we're gonna find out who he really is." The next day, while Sarah stayed home, Mark went to the town records office. When he came back, his face was pale. "Sarah, Mr. Henderson never sold the house. There's no record of it being bought. No new owner. Legally, Mr. Henderson is still the listed resident." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Then who the hell is that?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." Sarah grabbed her phone. "I'm calling the police." She dialed, pressing the phone to her ear. The line rang. And then, a voice picked up. "Hello, neighbors." Sarah dropped the phone. The voice on the other end, it was him. A knock came at the door. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Mark grabbed Sarah's hand. "Don't answer it," he whispered. They backed away. The knocking stopped. Silence. Sarah's breath shook. And then, the door handle turned. The door handle twisted once, then again. A slow, deliberate motion, as if whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "He's trying to get in," she whispered. Mark shook his head, pulling her back. "The door's locked. He can't." A sharp click echoed through the house. The door swung open. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, but the doorway was empty. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows over the steps, but there was no one there. Just the still, cold night pressing against the open door. Mark took a shaky step forward, peering out. Where did he? Sarah grabbed his wrist. Don't go out there." Mark hesitated. Then slowly, he reached for the door and pushed it shut. He locked it, double-checking the deadbolt. "He's messing with us," Mark whispered. Sarah backed away, her whole body trembling. "We have to leave. Right now. We can't stay here, Mark." Mark nodded. "We'll pack up, get a hotel for the night. We can figure it out later." Sarah didn't wait. She rushed upstairs, throwing clothes into a bag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it shut. Downstairs, she heard Mark rummaging through drawers, grabbing keys, wallets, essentials. Then, a sound, a whisper. "Going somewhere?" Sarah froze. It came from downstairs, from the living room. She crept to the top of the staircase, gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Mark was standing in the middle of the room, perfectly still. Across from him, the neighbor. He was inside. He stood just beyond the threshold, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes locked onto Mark. And he was smiling, a wide, stretched grin that didn't reach his eyes. Mark whispered, "How did you get in?" The neighbor blinked slowly. Then, he raised his hand, a perfect mirror of Mark's own posture. He tilted his head further. Mark's body moved, against his will, tilting in the exact same way. Sarah gasped. The neighbor copied him. No, he controlled him. Sarah ran down the stairs, grabbing Mark's arm. "Mark, we have to go." Mark struggled, his muscles stiff, his body fighting against her grip. The neighbor smiled wider. "Mark," he whispered. Mark's lips moved, but it wasn't his voice that came out. "Mark," the neighbor repeated. It was like an echo, bouncing between them, shifting, warping. Sarah screamed, yanking Mark back. The neighbor took a slow step forward, his movements wrong, too fluid, like he wasn't stepping at all, just gliding. Sarah shoved Mark toward the door. "Run!" She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the neighbor. It passed right through him. No impact. No resistance. Like he wasn't even there. But then, he turned, and now he was looking directly at her. "Sarah," he whispered. Her breath caught in her throat. Mark yanked her arm, dragging her out the door. They ran to the car, Mark fumbling with the keys. Come on, he hissed. He jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered. Wouldn't start. He tried again. Nothing. Sarah turned, looking back at the house. The front door was open again, and standing in the doorway, the neighbor, still smiling, still watching. But now there were two of him, one inside, one outside, and both were moving, slowly, toward them. Mark twisted the key again, his knuckles turning white. The engine sputtered once more. Nothing. Sarah was shaking, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Hurry, Mark," she cried. The neighbors, both of them, were stepping closer. Their movements were perfectly synchronized. Same tilt of the head, same steady steps, same unnatural, grinning faces. Mark slammed his fist against the dashboard. "Come on, damn it!" The car roared to life. Sarah barely had time to scream before Mark threw it into reverse, slamming his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, the car jerking backward. And then, a loud, sickening thud. Mark hit the brakes. His stomach twisted. Sarah was clutching her seat, her nails digging into the fabric. They had hit something, or someone. Mark turned his head, his heart pounding. In the red glow of the taillights, the neighbor stood behind the car. His body was twisted, his limbs at wrong angles. But he was still smiling. And then, before Mark could even process what he was seeing, the neighbor stood up. His bones didn't crack. His body didn't struggle. He just rose, fluid and effortless, like a puppet on invisible strings. Sarah screamed, "Drive!" Mark slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing. The neighbors, both of them, were still standing in the driveway watching, still smiling. Sarah clutched her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "Where do we go?" she asked. Mark shook his head, gripping the wheel. "As far away as possible." They sped through the empty streets, past darkened houses, past streetlights that flickered ominously overhead. The night stretched out before them, endless and hollow. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the door handle. "Mark, I don't think." Her voice faltered. Her stomach dropped, because ahead of them, standing in the middle of the road, was the neighbor. Mark cursed and swerved. The car veered violently to the side, tires skidding on the pavement. They nearly hit a streetlight before Mark regained control, panting, his hands shaking against the wheel. "How is he?" Sarah's voice trembled. Mark didn't answer, because when he looked in the rearview mirror, the neighbor was no longer on the road. He was in the back seat, sitting perfectly still, grinning. Going somewhere? His voice was wrong, a perfect echo of Mark's own voice. Sarah screamed. Mark slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, sending them both lurching forward. Sarah scrambled to open the door, her fingers slipping against the handle. But then, the neighbor moved. His arms stretched unnaturally, reaching toward them. Mark and Sarah flung the doors open, tumbling onto the pavement. They scrambled to their feet, running into the night, away from the car, away from the neighbor. But the farther they ran, the more neighbors appeared. One on the sidewalk, one stepping out from behind a tree, one standing under the flickering streetlight, each one identical, each one mimicking their movements, and all of them grinning. Mark grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling her forward as they ran. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their legs burning with every step. But no matter how fast they moved, the neighbors were there, always just ahead, always watching. Sarah choked out a sob. "Mark, we can't." "Keep running," he shouted, his grip tightening. They turned a corner, darting into a narrow alley between two houses. The shadows swallowed them whole, the air thick with the scent of damp pavement and old trash. Mark pressed Sarah against the wall, his hand over her mouth. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Sarah's body trembled against his. Footsteps. Soft, measured footsteps echoed through the alley. The neighbors were close. Mark dared to peek around the corner. A figure stood at the alley's entrance. It was him, his own face, his own eyes. But the smile was something else. The other Mark tilted his head, perfectly mirroring his movements. "You don't belong here," the thing said. Its voice was wrong. It sounded just like him, but hollow, stretched, as if spoken from deep inside an empty shell. Sarah whimpered. Mark pressed a hand to her mouth, his pulse hammering. The other Mark laughed. It was an exact copy of his own laugh. Then, it took a step forward, and another. Mark pulled Sarah's hand. "Run!" They bolted, racing deeper into the alley, their shoes slapping against wet pavement. They burst out onto another street, and stopped dead. Neighbors, lined up perfectly on either side of the road, each one identical, each one smiling. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "They're everywhere," she whispered. Mark's mind raced. They couldn't just keep running in circles. They needed to get away, to leave this town. He scanned the street, searching for anything that could help them. And then, his eyes locked onto something in the distance. The town's exit sign. The highway. Freedom. Come on. He pulled Sarah forward, dodging past the unmoving neighbors, their grins never faltering. The sign grew closer. Almost there. Almost. And then, the world shifted. It was like the entire street bent around them. The houses stretched. The pavement twisted. The exit sign blurred, then flickered out like a dying light bulb. Mark skidded to a stop, dragging Sarah back. What the hell? He gasped. The road ahead wasn't a road anymore. It was their street, their house, their driveway. Sarah turned, her face pale with horror. Mark, we're back. Mark's blood turned to ice. It was true. They had never left. The neighbors were still there, standing in the yard, standing on the porch, standing in the doorway of their house. Mark turned to run again, but something grabbed his wrist. He spun, expecting Sarah. It wasn't Sarah. It was himself. Another Mark, grinning. You should go inside, the thing whispered in his voice. Mark's vision blurred. His mind spun. He couldn't breathe. Sarah screamed. And then, the world went dark. Mark's eyes snapped open. He was inside the house. The living room was dimly lit, the air thick with silence. His body ached, his limbs heavy as if he had been asleep for hours. He sat up with a start. Sarah? No response. His heart pounded. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. Where was she? He turned toward the hallway, and froze. Sarah was standing there, her back to him, unmoving. Sarah, he called again, his voice shaking. She didn't answer. A chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. Sarah, what's? She turned. Mark staggered back. It wasn't Sarah. Not exactly. She looked like Sarah, same hair, same clothes, same familiar shape. But her eyes were wrong. Too wide. Too dark. And her smile. God, her smile. We belong here now, she whispered. Mark's blood turned to ice. No, he breathed. Yes. A voice echoed from behind him. Mark spun around. There, standing in the doorway, was himself. The other Mark, smiling. You can't leave, the thing said, tilting its head. Mark backed away, his pulse hammering. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. This is home, the other Mark said. Sarah, the thing wearing Sarah's face, stepped closer. You fought so hard, she whispered, but there's nowhere else to go. No, Mark choked out. Yes, they both said in unison. Mark's head spun, his vision blurred. The room felt smaller, the walls pressed in. He staggered, gripping his temples. No, this isn't real. This is home. Their voices surrounded him. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Mark turned and gasped. The living room mirror. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a window, a door, and on the other side, he saw himself, the real him, trapped, screaming, pounding against the glass. Help me, his reflection mouthed. Get out now. Mark's chest tightened. The other Mark, the imposter, followed his gaze and smiled. Don't listen to him, he whispered. This is where you belong. The mirror began to close. Mark didn't think, he ran. Straight toward the glass. Straight toward himself. The other Mark lunged, grabbing at him, nails digging into his skin. Mark shoved forward. The glass rippled. He pushed harder. And then, the world shattered. Mark hit the floor hard. His lungs burned. His head throbbed. For a moment, everything was spinning. Then silence. He gasped for air and pushed himself up. The living room was different. The furniture was right where it should be. The air felt real again. No strange heaviness, no pressing walls. Mark turned. The mirror. It was just a mirror now. His reflection looked back at him. Just him. No other version. No imposter. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. Sarah, he whispered. He spun around, scanning the room. Sarah. A sound. From the hallway. Mark ran. He burst into their bedroom and stopped cold. Sarah lay on the bed, eyes closed. Still. Sarah! He rushed to her, shaking her gently. She stirred, blinking. Mark, she whispered, voice groggy. Are you okay? Are you? He didn't know how to finish. He didn't know what to ask. Sarah frowned, rubbing her forehead. I think I had a nightmare, she said. Mark swallowed hard. Yeah, he said. Me too. Sarah sat up, confused. What time is it? Mark checked the clock. 3:47 a.m. Hadn't it been later? The time didn't make sense. Sarah sighed and leaned against him. I feel weird, she murmured. Mark held her tight. Me too, he admitted. They sat there in silence. But something gnawed at the back of Mark's mind. Something felt unfinished. Slowly, cautiously, he glanced toward the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, empty, but for a fraction of a second, Mark thought he saw movement. A shadow, a shape, and then a whisper, not from the room, not from Sarah, but from somewhere else, somewhere just beyond the walls. We belong here now. Mark's breath hitched. His blood ran cold. He closed his eyes and listened. The whisper faded, but he knew, deep down, it would never really be gone. Let's start with the next story. The distress signal came at dawn, a faint, crackling voice over the radio. Garbled words lost in static. Then silence. No coordinates. No ship name. Only a single phrase cutting through the interference. No one is left. Stay away. Captain Elias Holt stood at the helm of the Vanguard, staring at the radio. His first mate, Parker, shifted uneasily beside him. Another ghost ship. Parker said. Elias exhaled. Could be. Or someone in trouble. If they were alive, they'd be talking, Parker said. Elias turned his gaze to the horizon. The sun was creeping over the water, painting the waves in molten gold. Somewhere out there, a ship drifted, silent, empty. We find it, Elias said. Parker sighed but nodded. Aye, Captain. They charted the course. By midday, they spotted it. A massive cargo vessel floating aimlessly in the calm sea. No movement. No sound. Parker muttered, looks abandoned. Elias grabbed the binoculars and scanned the deck. No crew. No signs of struggle. Only the ship's name, barely visible through the rust. The Odessa. Elias felt a chill creep down his spine. He had heard of this ship. It was supposed to be halfway across the world, heading for South America. So what was it doing here? He turned to his crew. We board it. Standard protocol. Stay together, stay sharp. The crew of the Vanguard lowered a dinghy into the water. The sea was eerily still, the waves barely rocking them as they approached. As they neared, the silence deepened. No creaking metal, no lapping waves against the hull. Just silence. They climbed the ladder and stepped onto the deck. Elias called out, "Hello? Anyone aboard?" No answer. The air smelled of salt and something else, something foul. They moved carefully, footsteps echoing in the stillness. Parker pointed to the wheelhouse. The glass was shattered. Dried streaks of something dark smeared the doorway. Blood. Elias felt his gut tighten. "Weapons ready," he ordered. They entered the wheelhouse. The radio was destroyed, wires ripped from the walls. Papers littered the floor, most torn or stained. The captain's chair was overturned. And on the wall, scrawled in jagged, desperate letters, "It comes from below." Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. What the hell happened here? Parker whispered. Elias turned to his men. "Check the ship. We find out what happened." The crew split into pairs, moving cautiously. Elias and Parker made their way toward the lower decks. The deeper they went, the colder it became. A foul stench clung to the air. And then, a sound. Faint. Wet. A slow, dragging noise. Parker stopped. "Did you hear that?" Elias nodded, gripping his flashlight. They turned a corner and saw the first body, slumped against the wall, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and something was wrong with his hands. Fingers elongated, stretched, like they had been pulled. Parker cursed under his breath. Elias knelt beside the corpse. Something had killed this man, something unnatural. And then, the ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the metal itself. The lights flickered, and from somewhere in the darkness below, a whisper, low, guttural, a voice that did not belong to anything human. "You should not be here." Elias' breath caught in his throat. Parker gripped his arm, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Elias nodded slowly. The voice had not come from the radio. It had not come from the ship's intercom. It had come from the walls. A deep, slow groan echoed through the corridors, as if the Odessa itself was breathing. The lights overhead flickered again, their dim glow barely piercing the darkness. The air felt thicker now, heavy with something unseen, something waiting. Parker's grip on his flashlight tightened. "We should leave," he muttered. Elias shook his head. "Not yet. We need to find the logs. We need to know what happened." Parker exhaled sharply, but he knew better than to argue. They moved deeper into the ship, stepping carefully around the body slumped against the wall. More messages were scrawled along the corridors, written in what looked like rust or blood. "It sleeps beneath. The water is not silent. We opened the door. We let it in." Elias felt his stomach turn. "Someone went mad here," Parker whispered. Elias wasn't sure that was true. They reached the crew's quarters. The door hung open, swinging slightly, as if something had just passed through. Elias stepped inside first. The bunks were empty, but the sheets were stained, dark patches spreading across the fabric like ink in water. A single notebook lay open on a table. The pages were smeared, the ink running as if it had been touched by wet hands. Elias picked it up. The last entry was short, written in frantic, uneven strokes. "We heard it knocking from below. We thought it was the hull shifting. But then the knocks became words. It spoke. It learned our names. It is inside now. We are not alone. We were never alone." A sudden crash outside made them both spin around. Footsteps. Wet. Heavy. Coming toward them. Elias yanked his flashlight up, but the beam only cut through empty air. Nothing was there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing closer. Then, silence. A long, suffocating silence. Parker swallowed hard. "Captain?" Elias turned toward him, and saw the look of horror on his face. "Behind you," Parker whispered. Elias didn't turn. A cold breath brushed the back of his neck. Then, a voice. Low. Ancient. "You are too late." Elias spun, flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing. Only empty space where something should have been. Parker grabbed his sleeve. "We have to go. Now." Elias hesitated, then nodded. They turned and ran. The walls groaned around them, the ship shifting as if it were alive. The floor beneath them vibrated, a deep, pulsing rhythm like the heartbeat of something immense, something waiting. They reached the stairs, scrambling up toward the deck. Then the ship lurched. Elias was thrown against the railing, barely catching himself before he toppled backward. Parker grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. "Move." They reached the deck. The rest of the crew was already there, faces pale, eyes wide. "What the hell is happening?" someone shouted. Then, the sea changed. The water around the Odessa darkened, turning an inky black. And then it rose. Something massive. Something that had been waiting beneath the waves. A shape loomed just beneath the surface, too big to be a whale, too smooth to be rock. It was rising. Elias stared, heart hammering. "Get to the boat," he shouted. The crew scrambled toward the dinghy, lowering it into the water. But Parker had stopped, eyes locked on something behind Elias. "Captain," he whispered. Elias turned and saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the deck, drenched, unmoving. Its face was wrong, stretched, twisted, as if it had been melted and reshaped. And its eyes, they were staring directly at Elias. Then, it smiled and whispered, "The door is open." The Odessa groaned, metal twisting, the sound of something breaking free from below. And then the screaming began. The screams tore through the night, swallowed by the howling wind and the crashing waves. Elias grabbed Parker's arm and yanked him toward the lifeboat. The rest of the crew was already scrambling aboard, eyes wide with terror. The thing on the deck did not move. It only watched. "Go!" Elias shouted. One by one, the crew leapt into the lifeboat. But Parker hesitated. "Captain, look." Elias turned. The figure on the deck was not alone anymore. Shapes were emerging from the darkness. Drenched bodies, silent and unmoving, stepping forward from the shadows. Their eyes were empty, their mouths slightly open, as if whispering something too low to hear. Then, one of them lifted a hand and pointed, straight at Elias. A cold, crawling sensation spread down his spine. "Get in the boat!" Parker yelled. Elias didn't think. He grabbed the rope and dropped into the lifeboat just as the Odessa let out a deep, shuddering groan. The water around the ship was boiling. Something was rising. Something massive. The crew rowed desperately, the lifeboat rocking violently as they fought against the churning sea. Elias dared one last look back. The figures on the deck had not moved. They only watched. And then, the Odessa began to sink. Not slowly. It was being dragged down. The water pulled at it like grasping hands, swallowing the ship piece by piece. The deck vanished. Then the mast. Then the figures sinking without a sound. The last thing Elias saw before the Odessa disappeared completely was a single, pale face staring up from beneath the water, still smiling. Then, silence. The sea was calm again. No wreckage, no bodies, just empty water, stretching endlessly in all directions. The crew sat in stunned silence, gasping for breath. Parker clutched his chest, whispering, "What the hell was that?" No one answered, because no one knew. Elias stared at the water, his mind racing. The logs, the messages, the voices in the walls. We opened the door. We let it in. The ship had been doomed from the moment they found it, and now it was gone. But something told Elias it wasn't over. Not yet. A sound drifted across the water. Soft, almost a whisper, a voice, calling his name. Elias' breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, and saw something floating in the water beside the boat. A single waterlogged notebook, the same one he had read on the Odessa. It was open. A fresh line had been added to the last entry. "The door is open." Elias' hands trembled. The sea stretched wide around them, silent and empty. But he knew deep in his bones, they were not alone, and they never had been. Let's start with the next story. The house stood at the edge of town, hidden behind gnarled trees and overgrown vines. It had been empty for years, abandoned after the last owner vanished without a trace. No one wanted it. No one dared to go near it. But when Daniel inherited the mansion from a distant relative he had never met, he felt an odd pull toward it, as if something inside was calling him. Daniel stepped through the grand front doors, the hinges groaning like something waking from a deep sleep. Dust blanketed the floors, and cobwebs draped over the chandeliers like forgotten lace. He inhaled the musty air and exhaled slowly. The house was his now, whether he liked it or not. He spent the first few hours wandering from room to room, peeling back dusty sheets that covered furniture. The library was filled with books that smelled of old parchment. The dining hall had a long table, still set with silverware, as if waiting for a meal that would never come. But it was the study that caught his attention. Against the far wall stood an old grandfather clock, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Its frame was not made of wood or metal, but something pale and smooth. He ran his fingers over it, a chill creeping up his spine. It looked like bone. Daniel said, "That can't be right." The clock had no numbers, only deep etchings that looked like strange symbols. Instead of moving forward, the single hand ticked backward. A slow, deliberate movement. Tick. Daniel stepped back, suddenly uneasy. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't explain. Tick. He rubbed his arms. The temperature seemed to drop. He turned away, deciding he would explore the rest of the house later. But as he left the study, he swore he heard something. A whisper, a breath against his ear. Daniel said, "Just my imagination." He shook his head and went upstairs to find a bedroom. That night, the clock's ticking echoed through the mansion, a steady pulse in the silence. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked around him, old wood shifting in the night air. But beneath it all, the sound of the clock echoed through the halls. A slow, steady tick moving backward. Tick, tick. He turned onto his side, trying to ignore it. Tick. Daniel sat up. The sound wasn't just coming from the study anymore. It was closer. He swung his legs over the bed, listening. The air felt thick, pressing down on him. Tick. It was just outside his door. Daniel stood, his breath slow and controlled. He grabbed his phone, its dim glow barely lighting the room. Cautiously, he stepped toward the door and placed his hand on the knob. It was cold. He turned it. The hallway was empty. A wave of unease crawled over him. The house was silent now, too silent. He waited, listening, but the ticking had stopped. Daniel whispered, "Weird." He shut the door, locked it, and got back into bed. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling strange. His body felt off. He sat up and rubbed his face, pausing when his hands touched his skin. It felt smoother than usual. He stood and went to the mirror. His breath caught in his throat. He looked younger. Not by much, but enough to notice. His face was just a little less tired, the lines around his eyes barely visible. His hair, which had begun to gray at the edges, was darker. Daniel said, "What the hell?" He leaned closer, touching his skin. It wasn't possible. Maybe he had just slept well. Maybe it was the lighting. His gaze flicked to the door. The clock. He shook his head and laughed nervously. It was ridiculous. Clocks didn't make people younger. He was probably imagining things. But as he turned away from the mirror, something whispered in the back of his mind. A voice. Soft. Distant. Calling his name. Daniel spun around, his heart slamming in his chest. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. Silence. He took a step back, staring at his reflection. His pulse pounded in his ears. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe it was his own mind playing tricks on him. He needed air. Throwing on a jacket, he left the bedroom and made his way downstairs. The house was quiet, but the stillness felt unnatural, like something was waiting. He stepped into the study. The grandfather clock stood tall against the far wall, its skeletal frame gleaming in the dim morning light. He approached it slowly, his breath shallow. The hand still moved backward. Tick, tick. He reached out and touched the frame. The wood, if it even was wood, felt strangely warm. The bones woven into its structure seemed almost alive. He pulled his hand back, a shiver running down his spine. Daniel whispered, "This thing is cursed." The thought was absurd, but he couldn't shake it. He needed to get rid of it. Now. He grabbed the sides of the clock and tried to move it. It didn't budge. He pressed harder, using all his strength, but the clock was impossibly heavy. Then the ticking stopped. A sharp chill shot up his spine. The house seemed to exhale, the silence pressing in from all sides. He stepped back, breathing hard. And then, a sound. A slow, sickening creak from behind him. He turned. The study door, which had been open, was now shut. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling. He twisted it. Locked. Panic set in. He yanked at the knob, rattling the door. "Come on," he muttered. Something moved behind him. A shadow flickered against the wall, shifting unnaturally. It was tall and possibly thin. Its fingers stretched out toward him, elongating as if reaching for his back. Daniel spun around, but there was nothing there. His breath came in quick gasps. He turned back to the door and pounded on it. "Let me out," he shouted. The clock let out a deep, groaning chime. Daniel's body seized. His vision blurred. A cold wave rushed through him, and suddenly, the room disappeared. The darkness swallowed him whole. Daniel gasped, stumbling forward, but there was no floor beneath him. His body pitched downward, weightless, as if he had fallen into an endless void. The cold was unbearable, like ice had seeped into his bones. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, drowning out every thought. Then suddenly, he landed. His body slammed onto a hard surface, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He groaned, rolling onto his side, pain shooting through his ribs. The floor beneath him was smooth, almost polished, but when he reached out to touch it, his fingers met something rough. Bone. Daniel's breath hitched. He sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim surroundings. He was in a room, no, a cavernous space, stretching into the darkness. The walls, the ceiling, the very ground beneath him were made of bones. Skulls lined the walls in intricate patterns, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. Femurs, ribs, spines, all woven together, forming a grotesque architecture. And in the center of it all, the clock. It stood tall, more monstrous than before. The skeletal frame pulsed, as if breathing. The hands continued to move backward, ticking away at something unseen. Tick, tick, Daniel whispered, "Where am I?" A whisper answered him, a voice soft as silk. "You are where time unravels." Daniel whipped around. There was no one there. The whisper came again, from all directions at once. "You heard the clock. Now you belong to it." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He backed away, his footsteps echoing across the bony ground. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real." But the whisper only chuckled. "Tell me, Daniel, how old are you?" His breath hitched. The question sent a strange ripple through his mind. He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. How old was he? His hands trembled as he looked down at them. His skin, his fingers, something was wrong. His veins stood out more than before. His knuckles looked bonier. His skin seemed thinner, almost fragile. He was younger. He sucked in a sharp breath. "Tick-tock," the voice whispered. "Time is slipping away." Daniel stumbled back, his heart pounding. The walls seemed to shift, the bones rearranging themselves, forming new shapes, faces, twisted in silent screams. He had to get out. He turned and ran. But the room stretched endlessly. No doors, no windows, just the clock, standing in the center, its relentless ticking filling the air. Tick, tick, and with each tick, the world around him changed. Daniel kept running, his breath ragged, his limbs heavy. But no matter how far he went, the walls of bone stretched endlessly before him, shifting subtly as if mocking his attempts to escape. The whispering voice returned, curling around him like a cold wind. "You're wasting your strength." He skidded to a stop, panting. The air was thick, pressing against his chest like a weight. His fingers clenched into fists as he turned in a slow circle. "Show yourself," he shouted. The voice laughed softly. "I already have." The bones beneath his feet shifted. Daniel barely had time to react before they gave way, sinking like sand. He cried out, clawing at the ground, but the skeletal floor crumbled beneath him. He tumbled down, the world spinning, bones clattering around him like broken glass. Then silence. He lay still, waiting for the pain. But there was none. Slowly, he opened his eyes. He was no longer in the cavern. He was standing in the mansion again. The grand hall stretched before him, exactly as it had been before he had touched the clock. The gilded wallpaper, the towering chandeliers, the endless staircases spiraling into the dark. It was all there, as if nothing had changed. Except, Daniel turned sharply. The clock. It stood in the same place, its skeletal frame gleaming in the dim light. But something was different. The hands were no longer ticking backward. They had stopped, frozen. His stomach twisted. Daniel. The voice made him spin around. A woman stood at the base of the staircase. His breath caught. "Clara," he whispered. She smiled, but there was something wrong with it. Her expression was too still, her eyes too wide. "You've been gone so long," she said. His heart pounded. "Clara, what's going on? Where am I?" She tilted her head, the movement unnatural. "Home." His skin prickled. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He took a step forward, but she took a step back. "Don't come closer," she whispered. Daniel froze. Her body trembled. She raised a shaking hand and pointed. "Look at your reflection." His mouth went dry. Slowly he turned. A tall, antique mirror stood against the wall, and in it, his reflection wasn't his own. A boy stared back at him, no older than 10. Daniel's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. He touched his face. His hands were small. His skin was smooth. His hair was shorter. He was getting younger. Tick. The sound echoed through the mansion. Tick. The clock had started again. Daniel turned to Clara, his voice breaking. "Help me." Tears welled in her eyes. "You have to stop the clock." He swallowed hard. "How?" She stepped forward, lowering her voice to a desperate whisper. "Break it before it erases you." Tick. Tick. The sound grew louder. Daniel spun toward the clock. His time was running out. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he lunged toward the bone clock. His fingers, now those of a child, trembled as he reached for its skeletal frame. The ticking was faster now, erratic, like a heartbeat spiraling out of control. "Break it before it erases you." Clara's words echoed in his mind. He gritted his teeth, raised his fists, and slammed them against the clock's surface. The cold, ivory bones rattled under his touch, but they did not break. Tick, tick. He gasped, stumbling back. His body felt lighter. His clothes hung looser. He looked down, his legs were shorter, his hands even smaller. A choked cry escaped him. "No, no, no, no!" Clara rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Daniel, listen to me. You have to destroy the core." He swallowed hard. Where is it?" She pointed to the center of the clock. "Inside. You have to reach in." His stomach twisted. The hollow cavity in the middle of the clock seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. A small, dark opening sat at the center, no larger than a child's hand. Daniel's breathing quickened. His hand was small enough now. He had no choice. With a shuddering breath, he reached into the clock. The second his fingers slipped inside, something latched onto him. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around his wrist. A scream tore from his throat as something yanked him forward, pulling him deeper into the clock's hollow core. His vision swam. Darkness stretched out before him, endless and empty. Voices whispered, "Time belongs to us. You are part of the clock now." Tick, tick, tick. Pain seared through him. His mind blurred. His body felt weightless. And then, silence. He was floating. No, not floating. Suspended. He opened his eyes. The mansion was gone. The clock was gone. Everything was gone. Only darkness remained. And then, tick. A single sound echoed through the void. Daniel's breath caught. His body was no longer his own. He could feel it, the endless ticking. He was part of it now. The bone clock had taken him, and time would never let him go. It was dark, not just the absence of light, but a deep, swallowing blackness that stretched forever. Daniel could not feel his body. He could not move. He could not breathe. and yet he existed. Tick. The sound echoed through the void, a steady, rhythmic pulse. He recognized it instantly, the bone clock. But it wasn't outside of him anymore. It was within him. It was him. His thoughts felt stretched, his memories unraveling like loose threads. He tried to hold on to them, his mother's face, his father's voice, the smell of books in his childhood bedroom. But they slipped away, dissolving into the ticking. I'm still here, he told himself. But was he? Tick. Another pulse. And suddenly he felt again. Not his body, but something beyond it. A presence. No, many presences. They whispered in the dark. Time is hunger. Time is the mouth that devours all things. You are within the clock. You will keep ticking until you are nothing. Daniel's mind reeled. No, I can fight this. I have to fight this. He reached for his body, willing himself to move. A sharp snap echoed, and suddenly he saw something, images flickering like torn film. The mansion, the grand hall. Clara. She was still there. She was staring at the bone clock. It was no longer ticking. Its hands had stopped. She looked around frantically, searching for him. Her mouth moved, but he could not hear her. Then, with trembling hands, she grabbed the clock. She raised it high and threw it to the floor. Crash. The sound was deafening, a sharp, shattering noise that split the silence. Pain shot through Daniel's very being. It was like something had torn apart the fabric of his existence. He screamed. The void around him cracked. And then, light, blinding golden light. For the first time since being pulled into the clock, he felt himself falling. The whispers screeched in agony. The presence, the other souls, vanished. And then, he hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. His lungs. He gasped, eyes flying open. The mansion's ceiling loomed above him. Warm candlelight flickered against the walls. The cold wooden floor pressed against his back. He was back. He was alive. A sob broke from his throat. He turned his head. Clara was crouched beside him, eyes wide with shock. Daniel, she said, gripping his shoulders. Are you? He swallowed hard. His hands, his real hands, were shaking. I think, he took a breath. I think it's over. Clara's gaze flickered to the shattered remains of the bone clock. The pieces lay scattered, unmoving. For the first time since entering this house, there was silence. No ticking, no whispers, just silence. And yet, deep in his chest, Daniel swore he could still feel it. A faint, rhythmic pulse. Tick, tick, fading, but never truly gone. The silence in the mansion was heavy, almost suffocating. Clara helped Daniel sit up, her hands still trembling. Are you okay? She asked. Daniel nodded slowly, but the world around him felt strange, hazy, like he wasn't fully anchored in reality. His fingers dug into the floorboards, grounding himself. His eyes fell on the shattered remains of the bone clock. For something that had felt so powerful, so unstoppable, it looked so fragile now. The ivory-like pieces of its frame were scattered across the wooden floor. The hands, once moving in eerie reverse, were still. Clara exhaled sharply. It's over, right? Daniel wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. But something gnawed at the back of his mind. A sound. A faint rhythm. Tick. No. It was impossible. The clock was destroyed. And yet, tick. The noise was softer now, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It wasn't coming from the pieces on the floor. It was coming from inside him. Daniel's breath hitched. His pulse quickened. He clutched his chest, pressing his palm over his heart. The steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Was that it? Had the clock's curse become him? Daniel. Clara's voice pulled him back. She was staring at him with concern. He forced a weak smile. Yeah, he said. It's over. She studied him for a long moment, as if sensing there was something he wasn't telling her. But then she sighed and looked away, rubbing her face. We need to get out of here. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the job. This place, she shuddered. It's wrong. Daniel nodded. He wanted to leave more than anything. They stood up together, stepping carefully around the broken pieces of the clock. The mansion, once full of unseen movements and eerie echoes, felt strangely empty now. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight gone. As they reached the front door, Clara hesitated. Do you think anyone else is still trapped? Inside the clock? Daniel's chest tightened. He remembered the voices in the void, the whispers of those who had been lost before him. You will keep ticking until you are nothing. He swallowed. I don't know, he admitted, but we can't stay here. Clara didn't argue. She pushed open the door, and they stepped out into the cold night air. The mansion stood behind them, dark and silent. But as they walked away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. And deep in his chest, tick, tick, it was still there, waiting. That night, Daniel barely slept. Even with the warmth of his own apartment around him, even with the reassuring hum of the city outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara had called him when she got home. She said she felt exhausted but relieved. She told him they'd made the right decision, leaving that place behind, destroying the clock. He didn't tell her what he heard. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he pressed a hand to his chest again. It was faint, barely noticeable. But every time he focused, every time he tried to convince himself he was imagining it, he heard it again. Tick, tick. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was slower, like a clock still winding down. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He was just tired. His mind was playing tricks on him. He just needed rest. Eventually, exhaustion won. He drifted into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, something felt wrong. Daniel sat up in bed, his body heavy with fatigue. He rubbed his eyes, then froze. His hands, his fingers looked thinner. Not sickly, not unnatural, just younger. The skin was smoother. The faint scars from his childhood, ones he'd grown so used to seeing, were gone. His stomach twisted. He scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over himself as he rushed to the bathroom. The mirror reflected back a face that was his. But it wasn't. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes had softened. The shadow of stubble on his jaw was thinner, lighter. He looked younger. His breath came faster. He gripped the edges of the sink. No, he whispered. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But deep in his chest, tick, tick. He clenched his jaw, trying to ignore it, but the sound was there. Steady, unchanging. A countdown. His stomach lurched. He had to call Clara. Daniel fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed Clara's number. The ringing felt endless. His heart pounded, a sick feeling twisting in his gut. Finally, she answered. Clara said, "Hello." Her voice sounded groggy, like she had just woken up. Daniel said, "Clara, listen to me. Something's wrong." There was a pause. Then, more alert now, she said, "What do you mean?" Daniel gripped the phone tighter, staring at his reflection. Daniel said, I think it's still happening. I think the clock," he swallowed hard. "Clara, look at yourself in the mirror. Tell me if you notice anything different." Silence. A long one. Then Clara whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel's stomach dropped. Clara said, "Daniel, my hair, it's longer. It was shorter yesterday, I swear. And my hands, they look." She cut herself off with a sharp breath. No, no, no. This isn't real. We destroyed it, Daniel. We." Her voice cracked. Daniel said, "I know." But the truth was, he didn't know. None of it made sense. They had watched the clock burn, reduced to ash, its awful ticking silenced. Hadn't they? Then why was the sound still there? Tick, tick, a slow, dreadful rhythm inside his chest. Daniel said, "We need to go back." Clara's breath hitched. Clara said, "Back?" "No, Daniel, we." Daniel said, "We don't have a choice." He ran a hand through his hair, gripping it tightly. Daniel said, If we don't figure this out, it's going to keep going. Clara didn't respond right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was small. Clara said, "I don't want to disappear, Daniel." Neither did he. Daniel said, "Meet me at the mansion, before it's too late," and then he hung up. His fingers trembled as he grabbed his keys, heading for the door. Somewhere deep inside him, the ticking continued, and it was getting slower. Daniel drove through the empty streets, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The world outside felt eerily still, as if holding its breath. Streetlights cast long, warped shadows that flickered as he passed. His mind raced. The clock was gone, burned, nothing but ash. Then why was time still unraveling? He pulled up to the mansion's rusted gates and shoved them open with a screech. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows black voids. A place that should have been abandoned, yet never felt empty. Clara's car wasn't there yet. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror and flinched. His face was thinner, his skin paler. Time was slipping. Tick, tick. The sound vibrated in his skull, distant but steady. Daniel stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting his skin. The front door of the mansion groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood filled his lungs. The air was thick, heavy. The foyer was just as they had left it. The grand staircase twisted upward into shadows. The walls were lined with old paintings, their eyes seeming to follow him. But the fireplace, where they had burned the clock, was cold and lifeless, a pile of ash sitting in its grate. Daniel knelt beside it, running his fingers through the soot. It was real. The clock had been here. They had destroyed it. So why did he still hear it? A whisper of movement made him freeze. Daniel turned his head slowly. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision, just beyond the staircase. A shape. Tall. Thin. Watching. His breath caught. The shadows twisted then. A knock at the door made him jump. He spun around, his pulse hammering. Clara. Daniel rushed to open it, nearly yanking the door off its hinges. Clara stood there, shivering. Her eyes were wide, terrified. Clara said, "Daniel, something's wrong with me." She lifted her hands. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Her fingers were shorter. Not just thinner, physically smaller, like they had regressed in age. Clara whispered, "I think it's speeding up." Daniel grabbed her wrist, pulling her inside. Daniel said, "We need to figure out what's happening. Now." Clara's breathing was shallow. Clara said, "The clock's gone. So why is this still happening?" Daniel didn't have an answer. But deep in the mansion, hidden in the walls where they couldn't see, the ticking grew louder. Daniel felt the sound burrow into his skull, a rhythmic pulse beneath his skin. It wasn't coming from the fireplace. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside them. Clara clutched his arm, her fingers trembling. Clara said, "Daniel, what if it's not the clock? What if it's us?" Daniel shook his head, his mind rejecting the idea. Daniel said, No, that doesn't make sense. We destroyed it. It should be over." But it wasn't. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the grand staircase. They had to search the house again. They had to make sure the clock was truly gone. Each step they took felt heavier. The old wood creaked beneath their weight. The air smelled stale, untouched. The second floor stretched before them, a dark corridor lined with doors. A sound made them stop. A creak. Not from them. From the end of the hall. Daniel whispered, "Did you hear that?" Clara nodded, her grip tightening around his wrist. Then, tick, tick. Daniel turned his head sharply. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly open. A sliver of darkness yawned beyond it. Clara whispered, "We didn't open that." Daniel's throat was dry. Daniel said, "Stay close." They stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate. The hallway felt longer than before, stretching endlessly. The walls seemed taller. The paintings on them warped, shifting in the dim light. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the door. It swung open with a slow, groaning creak. Inside was a study. A large wooden desk sat in the center. Bookshelves lined the walls, their spines covered in dust. An old lamp flickered, casting an eerie glow. And on the desk, a clock. Daniel stopped breathing. It was smaller than the one before. More delicate, almost like it was still growing. Clara whispered, "No, that's not possible." Daniel stepped closer, his heart pounding. The clock was made of bone, its surface smooth, polished. But unlike the first one, this one had no numbers. Only a single hand, moving backward. Tick, tick. Clara said, "We burned it. We saw it turn to ash." Daniel felt something cold crawl down his spine. Daniel whispered, "What if we didn't destroy it? What if we just set it free?" The clock's hand jerked back another second. The room seemed to breathe. The shadows in the corners thickened. And then, the ticking stopped. Silence. Clara's breath hitched. And then, from behind them, a whisper, a voice they did not recognize. It said, "You cannot stop time. You can only trade it." Daniel spun around, his pulse slamming against his ribs. The room was empty, but the air wasn't. Something was there, watching, waiting. Then Clara gasped. Daniel turned back to her, and his blood turned to ice. She was shrinking. Her hair darkened, shortening to the length she'd had when they were teenagers. Her clothes sagged around her. Her eyes, wide with horror, looked younger. She was reversing. Clara whispered, "Daniel, help me." Daniel lurched forward, grabbing Clara's shoulders. His fingers sank into the loose fabric of her sweater. Daniel said, "No, no, stay with me." Her skin paled, her features softening. Her hands trembled as they shrank, her fingers growing thinner, more delicate. She was slipping backward. Clara whispered, "It's the clock, it's taking me." Daniel turned to the bone clock. The single hand twitched backward, slow and deliberate. Tick, tick. His stomach twisted. It was feeding on her. Daniel snarled, grabbing the clock with both hands. Daniel shouted, "Stop! Stop this!" The moment his fingers touched it, a bolt of ice shot through his arms. His vision swam. His head pounded. The walls warped, bending in on themselves. And suddenly, he wasn't in the room anymore. The world folded. Daniel staggered, gasping. The study had vanished. The house was gone. He stood in a vast, endless expanse of nothing. A black void stretched in all directions. No walls, no sky, no floor, just an empty abyss beneath his feet, keeping him suspended. And in front of him, the bone clock. Only now it was enormous, towering, a monstrous construct of twisting, interwoven bones. Its hand no longer ticked backward. It had stopped, and standing beside it, a figure, a man, or something that used to be a man. His skin was cracked and dry, stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes were sunken pits, hollow and hungry. His mouth curled into a grin that stretched too wide. The figure said, "You took what was never yours." Daniel's breath hitched. Daniel whispered, What are you?" The figure stepped forward, the bone clock groaning behind him. The figure said, "I was like you once, a man who thought he could defy time. I found the clock. I tried to destroy it. But time does not end. It only moves." Daniel's stomach churned. Daniel said, Then how do I stop it?" The figure tilted his head. The figure said, "You don't. You only bargain." Daniel shook his head. Daniel said, No, I won't let it take her. There has to be another way." The figure chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. The figure said, "There is always a price." And then the clock began to tick again. Slow, steady, but not backward this time. Forward. Daniel felt his body grow heavy. His breath came in ragged gasps. His skin tingled, his bones ached. It was taking him instead. Daniel gritted his teeth. Daniel shouted, "Take me, but let her go." The figure smiled wider. The figure said, "A noble choice. But time is greedy. It will take what it is owed." The ticking grew louder. Daniel clenched his fists, bracing himself. And then, the world shattered. Darkness exploded around him. The void collapsed, and Daniel fell. Daniel hit the floor hard, his body convulsing as he gasped for air. The impact sent a sharp pain through his ribs, but the cold was worse. It seeped into his skin, into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. He was back in the study. The bone clock sat on the desk, its single hand twitching erratically. Clara lay motionless on the floor. Daniel groaned, dragging himself toward her. Daniel said, "Clara, please wake up." Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Her skin was smooth now, her face younger than before. She was too young, barely more than a teenager. The clock had stolen decades from her in minutes. Daniel turned to the clock. Daniel snarled, "I won't let you take her." His hands shook as he grabbed it. The cold surged through his veins, but he held on. The bones beneath his fingers seemed to pulse, alive, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Daniel gritted his teeth. Daniel shouted, "You want a bargain? Then take me." The room groaned. The air thickened. A deep, guttural click echoed from the clock. And then, Clara gasped. Her body jerked, her fingers clutching at the air. Her eyes snapped open, wild and frightened. Clara whispered, "Daniel?" He exhaled in relief, pulling her into his arms. Daniel said, "I'm here." But something was wrong. Clara trembled. Her gaze darted around the room, her pupils dilated. Clara whimpered, "Why is everything so big?" Daniel froze. Her voice was too small. His stomach twisted as he pulled away, holding her at arm's length. She was younger, even younger than before. Her limbs were smaller, her frame delicate. She couldn't have been older than 10. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Daniel whispered, "No, no, no, no." The bone clock had overcorrected. It had taken too much from her, and as the realization hit him, the ticking grew louder. The single hand jerked backward again. It wasn't done. Clara clutched his arm. Clara whimpered, "Daniel, I'm scared." He held her tightly, his mind racing. If the clock kept going, it would take her all the way back, to nothing. Daniel turned to the desk. He had to end this. Now, with a cry, he grabbed the clock and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, bones splintering, gears spilling onto the floor. For a moment, silence. Then, a terrible, inhuman scream. The walls trembled. The floor shuddered beneath them. The air itself seemed to tear, splitting apart with a sound like breaking glass. Daniel clutched Clara as the world warped. And then, the clock's scream stopped. Everything went still. The room returned to normal. The air was warm again. The ticking had vanished. Daniel exhaled, his hands shaking. Clara pressed her face against his chest. Clara whispered, "Is it over?" Daniel didn't know, but as he looked at the shattered remains of the bone clock, he hoped it was. For now, Daniel sat on the cold wooden floor, holding Clara close. She was trembling, her small hands clutching at his shirt. He could feel her tiny heart racing against his chest. Daniel whispered, "It's over? I think." But was it? The broken pieces of the bone clock lay scattered across the floor, yet the air still felt wrong. The house was too silent, the walls pressing in on them like a held breath. Clara whispered, "Daniel, I don't feel right." He pulled back to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy with something he couldn't name. Daniel asked, "What do you mean?" She touched her own skin, running her fingers along her arms as if something was missing. Clara murmured, "I feel empty." A chill crawled up his spine. Then he saw it. Her fingers were thinner, not just small, fading. Daniel's breath caught. He grabbed her hands, turning them over in his own. They felt light, too light. He could almost see through them. Daniel whispered, "No, no, no, no." Clara whimpered. What's happening to me? It wasn't just her hands. The fading was spreading, creeping up her arms, toward her shoulders. Her hair, once thick and dark, was losing color, turning wispy like smoke. Daniel gripped her shoulders. Daniel pleaded, "Stay with me. You have to stay with me." Clara looked up at him, her young eyes filled with terror. Clara cried, "I don't want to disappear." Panic surged through Daniel's veins. His mind raced. The clock had reversed her age, but now it was as if time was erasing her completely. He scrambled to the shattered remains of the bone clock, digging through the pieces. There had to be something, anything, to stop this. His fingers closed around the largest fragment, the central gear still twitching as if trying to tick. Daniel muttered, "Come on, work. Work, damn you." He pressed it to his chest, willing it to reverse what it had done. The air trembled. The house groaned. And then, a whisper. Not a sound, not a voice, just a presence pressing against his mind. Daniel shuddered. Daniel whispered, "What do you want?" A single word formed in his thoughts, cold as death. Time. The bone clock had taken Clara's time away, and now it demanded something in return. Daniel clenched his jaw. Daniel said, "Take mine. Just bring her back." The presence lingered. The air thickened. Then, pain. A searing, burning pain shot through his chest. His breath caught as his vision blurred. It felt like something was being ripped from him, thread by thread. He gasped, clutching at his skin, feeling the years drain from his body. His fingers thinned. His arms weakened. His vision swam as his own reflection shimmered in the broken glass of the clock's remains. He was getting younger. The room spun. Clara's voice called to him, but it was distant now, fading as the world tilted. And then, darkness. When Daniel woke, it was to an unbearable stillness. The air felt thick, like a fog that never lifted. He blinked, trying to focus, but everything was wrong. The room around him was blurry, the walls too high, the floor too far beneath him. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. His arms trembled weak, and when he looked down, he saw that they were thinner, smaller, childlike. His heart pounded in his chest, confusion mixing with growing panic. Daniel whispered, "No, no, no, no." His voice was higher, softer. He staggered to his feet, wobbling like a child learning to walk. The pain was gone, but the disorientation was overwhelming. He looked around, and everything seemed out of place. The furniture, the shapes in the room, everything looked too big for him now. It was then that he saw her. Clara was sitting on the floor, her back to him. Her form was hunched, small and frail, like a child who'd been stripped of her years. Clara whispered, "Daniel." Her voice was weak, thin. It wasn't the voice of the child she had been just moments ago, but something older, something broken. Daniel stumbled toward her, calling her name, but as he reached out to touch her, she shrank away. Clara sobbed, You shouldn't have done that." Her eyes were wide with fear, filled with a loss that Daniel couldn't comprehend. She looked up at him, her face twisted in terror. Clara whispered, Why did you trade our lives?" Daniel shook his head, trying to make sense of her words. Daniel said, I didn't mean to. I wanted to save you." Her face contorted, her hands clutching her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. Clara cried, "But you didn't. You just made it worse." Daniel's heart broke. He couldn't understand. Everything had seemed like it would fix itself, like the clock would reverse it all. But now, the pain, the fading, it was still happening. Clara began to tremble, shrinking even more, until she looked no older than a toddler. Her voice was barely audible now, as though she was fading from existence entirely. Clara whimpered, "I don't want to disappear." Daniel fell to his knees beside her, his small hands reaching out to comfort her, but as he touched her arm, he realized she was already gone. The life, the spirit, the very essence of her, was slipping away, evaporating into the air. Clara's eyes went vacant. her body crumbling in on itself like dust. Daniel felt a coldness settle over him. The room felt even larger now, as if it was swallowing him whole. His heart raced, but there was no one to hear it, no one to stop the inevitable. The bone clock had taken them both. He had traded it all for the wrong price. In his desperation, Daniel turned to the clock's remains, the last remnants of its twisted gears scattered across the floor. He reached for the largest shard, feeling it pulse beneath his fingers. His reflection caught in the shard, and he saw. He was no longer a child. He was nothing, a shadow of a person, barely holding on. The bones of the clock hummed softly, as if mocking him. His grip tightened around the shard. Daniel whispered, "Please, I'll do anything. Just, please bring her back." The presence that had haunted them stirred again. The same cold, heavy feeling pressed into his mind. But this time, the voice didn't answer. It didn't offer a bargain or even a whisper. It simply waited. Daniel clenched his teeth, his small form shaking with fear and anger. Daniel shouted, "You took everything. You took her." But nothing answered. His hands began to tremble violently as his chest tightened. His breath quickened. The pain from before returned, but this time it was sharper. He could feel it. He was slipping, vanishing. Every second was a year lost. Daniel looked at the bone clock one last time, its ticking still echoing through the emptiness of the room. The presence, the thing that had played with their lives, was still there, just beyond his reach. But he could feel the weight of his mistake now. He had called out to it. He had begged for something he could never understand. And now, there would be nothing left. "You said, continue with the next part," ChatGPT said. As the last fragments of Clara's presence faded into nothingness, Daniel could feel himself slipping away too. His once frantic thoughts began to blur and slow, the edges of his vision darkening. It was as though the clock's curse was working in reverse again, erasing everything, pulling him into the void of nothingness. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing the floor, trying to hold on to something, anything. But the weight of his regret was crushing. His heart raced with one last desperate thought. Had it all been worth it? The bone clock lay beside him, still ticking its slow, backward rhythm. A chilling, hollow sound, like the heartbeat of something far older than he could comprehend. Daniel whispered to himself, voice cracking, "I didn't mean for it to end like this." But it was too late. There was no one left to hear him. His breath began to slow, his fingers twitching as the room seemed to grow colder. He could still feel the weight of Clara's absence pressing against his chest, and it burned. It felt like a fire and ice, both at once. The warmth of her memory was all that remained, slipping through his fingers like sand. The clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. With each passing second, it felt as if time itself was trying to swallow him whole. Suddenly, a voice broke through the stillness. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then grew clearer. A voice that was not his own. The voice came from deep within the darkness, from the very heart of the room. The voice said, "It doesn't end here." Daniel's body tensed. He tried to look up, but the room around him was now nothing more than a blur of shadows. The voice repeated itself, growing louder, more defined. The voice said, "You think you can escape it? The clock doesn't let go so easily." Daniel tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his voice failing him. The darkness was too thick now, filling his lungs with cold, suffocating air. He gasped, a futile attempt to breathe, but the air was thin, impossible to grasp. And then there was light. A faint glow, not from the clock, but from somewhere far beyond it. It pierced the darkness, cutting through like a thread of salvation. But Daniel couldn't reach it. His hands were shaking, his arms no longer his own. The voice came again, this time almost a sigh, echoing through the vast emptiness. The voice said, "You should have let go when you had the chance." And then, just like that, the glow vanished. The darkness returned, overwhelming, suffocating. Daniel's limbs grew weaker, his senses duller. as if time itself was pulling him back into the nothingness from which he had emerged. The last thing he heard was the sound of the bone clock, ticking backward, its rhythm marking the death of his hope. Daniel knew now what he had truly traded for. The clock had taken more than Clara. It had taken him too. Everything. And as the final whisper of his own existence faded into silence, the clock ticked on. Still ticking backward, as though it had never stopped. The clock kept ticking, its strange rhythm now familiar, but infinitely unsettling. Julian stood frozen in place, heart pounding in his chest as he looked at the bone clock, the hands moving backward, faster than before. His body was aging rapidly now, his face wrinkling, hair thinning, his strength draining away with each passing second. His hands trembled, reaching out to touch the clock, but he knew it was too late. There was nothing that could stop the madness. He looked around at the wreckage of the mansion, the remnants of a life that had crumbled into dust. His friends, those who had touched the clock, had all vanished, fading away into nothingness. He could hear their voices, faint whispers echoing from some distant corner of the house, calling his name. "Help me, please," someone cried, but Julian knew it was not real. It was a trick. The clock was toying with him, feeding on his fears. He looked at the clock one final time. There was no escape from it, no way out. The curse of the bone clock was inevitable. The backward ticking would not stop until there was nothing left of him. Nothing left of anyone who dared to listen. A loud creak echoed through the mansion, followed by a deep, sorrowful groan. The clock's hands froze, and the ticking stopped altogether. In that silence, Julian felt something shift in the air, something heavy, suffocating, and ancient. The darkness around him deepened, shadows stretching longer and longer, curling into the corners of the room, as if they were alive. Then from behind him, he heard a voice. "You can't stop it," it said, calm and certain. "No one can." Julian spun around, heart racing as he faced the source of the voice. There, standing in the doorway, was someone he knew all too well. His own reflection. But it wasn't him. It was a twisted version of him, older and more decayed, skin clinging to bones, eyes hollow and empty. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. "We were all part of it," the figure whispered, its voice hollow. "The clock is us. It feeds on us. We feed on it." Julian tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, touching his arm, and the warmth left his body instantly. He felt his energy, his very essence, being drained. The clock had no mercy. It had no end. His reflection smiled, a grin that was both horrified and ecstatic at the same time. "We are part of the clock now," it said, "and you will be too." Julian's knees buckled as the reflection's cold fingers wrapped around his arm, the energy within him slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The mansion around him seemed to darken further, the walls groaning, the air thickening with each breath. He wanted to pull away, to run, but his body was failing him. His strength was gone. "Why?" he gasped, struggling to form words as the reflection leaned closer, its eyes glowing with an eerie, empty light. "You knew the answer from the start," the figure whispered. "The clock was never meant to be a tool. It was meant to be a part of us. And now, you'll be part of it too." Julian's vision blurred as his body twisted, the bones inside him creaking and contorting. His flesh pulled tight around his frame, and he felt as if every inch of his being was being reversed, pulled backward through time. He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat, unable to form. Then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the room went still. The darkness that had taken over the mansion receded, leaving only the faint tick-tick-tick of the bone clock behind. But Julian was no more. His body, now nothing but a crumpled shell, was still standing, frozen in place, like all those who had come before him. The bone clock, now still and silent, sat in the corner of the room. Its ticking had stopped. The curse, for now, was complete. The mansion fell silent, save for the whispers of those lost, trapped in its endless time loop, forever bound to the cursed clock. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the faintest echo of the clock's tick began to stir again, ready to claim its next victim. The story, as old as time itself, would never end. As the last echoes of the bone clock's tick faded into the oppressive silence of the mansion, the air itself seemed to grow still, as if holding its breath. Julian's body, now distorted and withered by the unnatural aging process, crumpled to the floor like a doll discarded after a game. The mansion, once alive with the sound of footsteps and distant whispers, became a mausoleum, a place where time had no meaning, and the clock, with its sinister power, was the only ruler. The reflection, no longer a mere imitation of Julian, stood still beside the fallen form. It seemed to watch, its eyes empty and hollow, as though the very essence of Julian had been absorbed into the clock, trapped in the twisted cycle that would never end. And then, as the mansion sighed under the weight of its curse, the last thing Julian saw, before everything slipped into eternal darkness, was the faint glow of the clock's face. A hollow reminder that in this place, no one could escape, no one could leave, not when time itself had turned against them. The mansion's doors, once an entry point into the unknown, remained shut, its windows black and uninviting. Outside, the world went on, unaware of the horrors that unfolded inside, unaware of the countless souls lost to the relentless tick of the bone clock. The mansion stood, waiting for its next visitor. The clock, ticking backward, was patient. Time, after all, was eternal, and so the curse would continue forevermore. Let's start with the next story. It was late when David first noticed it, his shadow, that is. It wasn't something he could immediately explain or brush off. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, or perhaps his own tired eyes playing games with him. But there was no denying it now. As he stood in the dim living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, he felt an unease settle in his chest. The shadow that lay on the floor, stretching out from his feet, seemed off. For one thing, it was moving, and for another, it was growing. He blinked. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then it moved again, slowly, like a tendril of darkness creeping from the corner of the room, inching along the floor. David stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off of it. His shadow was bending, twisting in ways it shouldn't have. It shouldn't have been possible. Shadows didn't do that. Just a trick of the light, he muttered under his breath. But even as he said the words, the shadow stretched longer, more deliberate, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. David's heart started to race. He wasn't one to be easily spooked, but this was different. The shadow seemed to pulse with some strange energy, like it was alive. Slowly, he backed away, moving toward the light switch on the wall. The moment he stepped away from the shadow, it stopped moving, as if it had been waiting for him to act. With a shaky hand, David flicked the light switch, the room now flooded with brightness. The shadow disappeared immediately, as if it had never been there at all. But David knew better. Something was wrong. He could feel it. He didn't sleep that night. Lying in bed, the faintest of sounds kept him awake, the creaks and groans of the house settling, the occasional wind rattling the windows. But what troubled him the most was the sensation that something was watching him. Something just outside of the light. The next morning, he woke with a strange sense of dread lingering in his chest. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it had all been a nightmare. Shadows didn't move on their own. But when he stepped into the kitchen, the feeling crept up again. He glanced at the floor. His shadow was there. But this time it was bigger, taller. It loomed over him, stretching unnaturally toward the walls, as if it had been waiting for him. David's blood ran cold. He turned his back to it, telling himself again that he was being foolish. But the sensation was undeniable. Every step he took seemed to make the shadow grow more pronounced, more alive. It wasn't just his shadow anymore. It was something else. He slammed the door to the kitchen behind him and stood in the hallway, trying to steady his breath. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered like something just out of reach, something waiting to pounce. That evening, David sat in his living room, staring at the floor, waiting. His mind raced, questioning what was real. What could he trust? He didn't want to turn on the light again, didn't want to admit that his shadow was doing more than just following him. But when he looked down, there it was, moving, slithering, stretching. "Stop," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, just stop." The shadow didn't listen. It reached out from the floor like a living thing, pushing toward him with purpose. He could feel its presence, cold and heavy. It seemed to whisper in the silence, a low, haunting hum that crawled beneath his skin. David staggered back, his legs unsteady. The darkness seemed to close in on him. His shadow began to stretch even further. It wasn't a mere silhouette anymore. It was something more, something otherworldly. The shape twisted and buckled, a distorted version of himself that seemed to have a life of its own. "No!" David shouted, but the words caught in his throat. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or tear his eyes away from the creeping darkness that now filled the room. And then, without warning, the shadow detached from the floor and slithered up the wall, pooling in the corner. For a moment, there was silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. David's breath hitched in his chest as the shadows began to grow even more. They stretched across the walls, spilling onto the floor and creeping along the ceiling. And then something worse happened. The shadows began to shape themselves, forming a figure. A tall, dark shape, barely discernible in the flickering light of the dying lamp. David's legs wobbled beneath him as he struggled to move. It was as if something was holding him back, pulling him toward the corner where the shadows now danced and twisted. The figure in the shadows was growing larger, more menacing every second. Then it moved. The figure stepped out of the darkness, emerging into the light. The room grew colder, the air thick with dread. It was him, but not. It was a twisted version of him, the features warped, the eyes empty voids that seemed to gaze into his soul. David's mouth went dry as the figure took a step forward. It mirrored his every move, but the steps were heavy, deliberate. He tried to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. His legs were rooted to the floor, and his chest tightened as if the very air around him had turned to stone. The figure reached out, its hands stretching, fingers twisting like the shadows themselves. "Help!" David tried to yell, but no sound came. The figure's shadowy hand closed around his wrist, cold and unyielding. The dark hand pulled him closer, inch by inch, until their faces were almost level. It whispered in his ear, the voice low and rasping. "You cannot escape. I am you. I am what you hide." David's body shuddered. He wanted to break free, to tear himself away from the chilling grip, but he couldn't. His shadow, the thing that had once been his own, had become something far darker, far more dangerous. As the shadowy figure drew closer, David's body finally gave in. He felt the cold embrace of the darkness wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into its suffocating grip. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the shadow's face, a twisted reflection of his own, and the feeling that it would never let him go. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the room seemed to whisper in the dark, "Now you are mine." And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.